Hey guys, tonight we are going to take a deep, slightly uncomfortable dive into the past, specifically into a time before something we take utterly for granted was a common part of daily life. Soap. Imagine just for a moment stepping out of your modern, climate-controlled bubble and into a bustling, sun-baked marketplace from, say, 500 years ago. The air hits you not just with the scent of spices and cooking fires, but with the inescapable, pervasive hum of humanity itself. Not the sanitized hum of a modern crowd, but the raw, unfiltered olfactory symphony of bodies that haven't seen a thorough soapy scrub in weeks, maybe months. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes before your delicate modern sensibilities staged a full-blown rebellion, and your nose filed a formal complaint with your brain. It's a reality so far removed from ours, it's almost science fiction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and the world is different. It's not just the architecture or the clothes people wear or the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestone. It's the air itself, thick, heavy, with layers of scent that tell stories your nose isn't calibrated to understand. This is a world where personal hygiene isn't about eliminating body odor. It's about managing it, layering over it, or simply accepting it as part of the background noise of existence. We're talking about a time covering millennia across various civilizations, where the concept of using a chemical agent specifically designed to lift dirt and oil off the skin and wash it away with water wasn't the norm. Soap, as we know it, a solid or liquid made from fats or oils mixed with lye or alkali, existed in various forms, sure, but it wasn't cheap, it wasn't mass-produced, and it certainly wasn't something the average person used daily or even weekly for personal washing. Think about your daily routine. Shower in the morning, maybe another after a workout. Wash your hands countless times. Your clothes go into a washing machine regularly. Deodorant, non-negotiable for most. Mouthwash, a toothpaste, all designed to keep you smelling and feeling fresh. Now strip all that away. Imagine waking up, maybe splashing some cold water on your face, if water is easily accessible and clean, which wasn't a given either. Perhaps wiping down with a damp cloth. That's your bath for the day, or maybe the week, or depending on the era and location, maybe the month. How did people manage? How did they interact closely? More importantly, how did they flirt? In a world where standing too close to someone might involve a significant olfactory experience, the subtle dance of attraction must have been profoundly different. Forget about lean-ins and whispered sweet nothings, unless you were prepared for a very intimate introduction to someone's personal ecosystem. Life before widespread soap was a masterclass in adaptation. People relied on other methods to cleanse, to freshen, and to make themselves appealing. Sand, ash, clay, plant extracts, oils. These were the cleansers of choice for many, used in conjunction with water when available. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, were famously meticulous about cleanliness compared to some later civilizations, using animal and vegetable fats mixed with alkaline salts to create a soap-like substance, primarily for washing textiles, but also, to some extent, for personal use. That's a mainstream historical fact right there. Soap existed, but its function and availability were very different. It wasn't the personal hygiene staple we know. It was more like a heavy-duty cleaner. So when you wanted to make a good impression on that potential significant other across the crowded, pungent room, simply being clean in the modern sense wasn't really an option for most. You couldn't just wash away your natural scent profile and replace it with something manufactured. You had to work with what you had or try to mask it with other, stronger smells. This is where things get interesting. The focus shifted from cleanliness as odor removal to scent management as attraction enhancement. Consider the air quality. Before industrial pollution became a major issue in urban centers, the ambient air might have been cleaner in some ways, less smog perhaps, but the localized human-generated smells were amplified. Waste disposal was rudimentary or non-existent in many places. Animals were everywhere. The overall sensory environment was much more intense, much more alive with smells. Your personal scent wasn't just competing with other people, it was competing with the street, the stable, the market, the tannery down the lane. Historians still argue whether the infrequent bathing habits of certain periods, like parts of the European Middle Ages, were primarily due to a lack of understanding of hygiene, fear of water, believed by some to spread disease by opening pores, lack of fuel to heat water, or simply cultural preference. It's one of those open questions that highlights how different their priorities and beliefs were compared to ours. Was it a pragmatic choice based on resources, or a philosophical one based on humoral theory and disease? We may never know for sure, but the result was a population that wasn't exactly springing into their clothes smelling of springtime meadows. This lack of pervasive cleanliness had tangible effects on social interactions. Handshakes, embraces, dances, anything involving close physical proximity would have been a more immersive experience. When you leaned in to share a secret or offer a compliment, you were getting the full sensory package. This wasn't necessarily seen as universally bad, of course. Our modern aversion to natural body odor is culturally conditioned. In many historical periods, a certain level of natural musk wasn't just tolerated, it might have been considered normal or even attractive. You hear stories, perhaps apocryphal, of lovers exchanging unwashed linens as tokens of affection. While maybe not the most romantic image by today's standards, it points to a different relationship with personal scent. It's a quirky tidbit, but it makes you think, doesn't it? Giving someone your sweaty handkerchief might have been the equivalent of a modern love letter. Or maybe just a really direct hint about laundry day. The economics of cleanliness played a huge role too. Water wasn't always on tap. Heating water required fuel and effort. Soap, when available, was a manufactured good, often taxed or expensive. So while the wealthy might have had access to private baths, drawing water, heating it, and expensive imported perfumes or cleansing agents, the vast majority of the population relied on simpler, less effective methods, or simply bathed infrequently out of necessity rather than choice. A peasant living in a small village wouldn't have had the luxury or the resources for a daily soak. Their cleaning efforts would likely focus on hands and face, perhaps a more thorough wash of specific body parts when needed, using water and maybe some ash or rough cloth. Laundry was a whole separate, arduous task involving boiling water, lye, and beating clothes. Not something done casually. Imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Your smile, your wit, your fine or not so fine clothes, and your general presence all mattered, but they were layered over your fundamental human smell. Flirting wasn't just about what you said or how you looked. It was also, inescapably, about how you smelled, or how you tried not to smell, perhaps. This gave rise to fascinating strategies for attraction that went far beyond simply being clean. They involved artifice, distraction, social signaling, and a completely different understanding of what constituted personal appeal. You couldn't just wash your troubles away. You had to perfume them into submission. It adds a whole new layer of complexity to historical romance, doesn't it? Makes those sweeping love stories feel a little more grounded, perhaps even a little sticky. This foundational reality, the general state of being less than sparkling fresh by modern standards, colored every social interaction, including the delicate dance of courtship. How did you signal interest when physical closeness brought a whole new set of variables into play? How did you distinguish yourself from the olfactory background noise? These are the questions that start to peel back the layers on historical flirting, revealing methods and manners that seem utterly alien to us today, but made perfect sense in a world where the nose played a much more prominent, unavoidable role in human connection. It wasn't necessarily about finding the absence of scent, but perhaps finding a bearable or even interesting scent profile among the crowd. Or maybe just finding someone who used enough flowers to create a small, walkable radius of pleasantness around them. It's a challenge you certainly don't face when swiping right. Potential match, bio says enjoys long walks on the beach and minimal personal hygiene. Probably not hitting that super like, So as we venture deeper into this scent-filled past, keep in mind that the baseline is fundamentally different from anything you experience daily. Every interaction, every gesture, every attempt at attraction is happening against a backdrop that smells, well, let's just say authentic. And understanding that is the first step to understanding how flirting ever happened at all before soap became your trusty wingman. So given this fragrant reality we've just stepped into, how did anyone manage to feel, or at least appear, presentable enough to even contemplate the subtle art of attracting another human? If soap wasn't the everyday answer, what was? Well, ancient people were nothing if not inventive, especially when faced with the universal desire not to smell too much like a forgotten gym sock left in a swamp. Their approaches to cleanliness were varied, often ingenious, and sometimes, by our standards, frankly bizarre. Forget the lather, rinse, repeat. Their routine was more like oil, scrape, powder, repeat, occasionally. Oils were incredibly important. Across the Mediterranean world, from the Greeks and Romans to the Egyptians, olive oil or other plant-based oils served a dual purpose. It was both a moisturizer and a cleanser. You'd rub oil into your skin, perhaps mixed with fine sand or ash to give it some abrasive quality. This mixture would theoretically bind to dirt, sweat, and dead skin cells. Then you'd use a strigil, a curved metal instrument, to scrape it all off. Imagine trying to get ready for a hot date by essentially French frying yourself and then scraping off the excess. Sounds efficient? Mainstream historical fact: the strigil was a common tool for personal hygiene in ancient Greece and Rome, used after exercise or bathing in public baths. It was their loofah and soap substitute rolled into one, only significantly more medieval torture device looking. This oil and scrape method wasn't just about removing grime. It also left a thin layer of oil on the skin, which could help with dryness, protect from the elements, and perhaps even provide a base for applied scents. It wasn't a deep clean like soap and water provides, dissolving fats and washing them away. It was more of a surface-level removal. You'd get rid of the top layer of grossness, but the underlying you would remain, scent and all. Think of it less as washing your car and more like wiping down the dashboard. It looks better, but it's not exactly spotless under the hood. Water was still used, of course, when available and accessible. Public baths were a significant feature of Roman life, for example, but they were more than just places to get clean. They were social hubs, gyms, libraries, and places to eat. The bathing ritual often involved moving through rooms of varying temperatures, warm, hot, cold, and incorporating the oil and strigil method. So while the Romans valued cleanliness more than some subsequent cultures, their clean was achieved through processes that feel very different from our shower gel routine. And let's be honest, public baths, while amazing feats of engineering and social gathering points, could also get pretty ripe with hundreds of people oiling, scraping, sweating, and, well, everything else that happens when lots of bodies are in close proximity. Beyond oils and scraping, other substances were employed. Various forms of alkali, like natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt mixture, used by the Egyptians, could be mixed with fats to create soap-like compounds. But as mentioned, these were often harsh and primarily used for laundry or treating skin conditions rather than gentle daily washing. Wood ash contains lye and was also used particularly for washing clothes or as a harsh cleansing agent. Rubbing ash on your skin might get some dirt off, but it's also incredibly drying and potentially irritating. Imagine swapping your hydrating body wash for a handful of cold fireplace ash. Sigh. Romance. Plants offered another avenue. A variety of plants contain saponins, compounds that create a frothy lather when mixed with water and have detergent-like properties. Things like soapwort root, yucca root, or certain types of berries were used in different parts of the world as natural cleansers. They could lift some dirt and oils, and might also impart a natural earthy scent, which was probably preferable to other scents. These plant-based cleansers were a step closer to soap, but still often less effective and harder to produce consistently than later forms of soap. Using soapwort is like washing your hands with a slightly bubbly twig. Better than nothing, but not exactly Mr. Puddles' premium body wash. Deodorizing was also a major concern, separate from cleaning. Since you couldn't necessarily wash away the source of odor effectively, you had to counteract it or cover it up. Perfumes, incense, fragrant oils, and powders were essential tools in the ancient world's hygiene kit. The Egyptians used elaborate unguents and perfumes, often made from plant resins, flowers, and spices mixed with fat or oil. These weren't just for smelling nice, they were also part of religious rituals and social signaling. Applying expensive perfume was a clear sign of wealth and status, an attempt to project an aura of luxury and refinement that hopefully overpowered any less desirable natural emanations. The Romans also loved their perfumes, using them on their bodies, clothes, even in their homes and public spaces. The sheer volume of perfume used in the ancient world suggests a constant battle against prevailing odors. It was less about smelling clean and more about smelling like something else, preferably something expensive and exotic. Imagine walking into a room and being hit with a wall of frankincense, myrrh, rose oil, and sweat. It was a complex, multi-layered olfactory experience. Trying to flirt in that environment must have required a strong nose and an even stronger constitution. Excuse me, is that eau de Nile mud and jasmine you're wearing? Fascinating. Sweating was also considered a way to cleanse. Indigenous cultures in various parts of the world used sweat lodges or saunas, believing that sweating profusely would purify the body. The Romans had their hot rooms, caldarium, in the baths. While sweating does expel some toxins and can rinse the surface of the skin, it's not a replacement for washing away dirt and oils with a surfactant like soap. You get rid of some stuff, but you'd also end up wet and sweaty. Again, it's a cycle. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for ancient bathing practices was hygiene, social ritual, religious purification, or simply pleasure. It's probable it was a mix of all these factors, varying by culture and period. For example, Egyptian purification rituals were tied closely to their religion and daily life, involving frequent washing. Roman baths were undeniably social and leisurely, but cleanliness was also a stated goal. In other cultures, practical concerns like removing dirt and sweat after manual labor might have been the main driver, using whatever simple means were available. Trying to disentangle the why behind ancient cleanliness habits is complicated because their worldview didn't neatly separate health, religion, social status, and personal comfort in the way ours does. Beyond the everyday, specific methods were used for particular areas. Dental hygiene, for instance, involved chewing sticks, using abrasive powders made from crushed bone, or eggshells mixed with myrrh or other substances, or rinsing with mouthwashes made from vinegar or herbal infusions. Bad breath, in a world of pervasive odors, was probably just another note in the symphony, but efforts were clearly made to mitigate it, perhaps recognizing that a noxious mouth could severely hinder romantic advances, even in a pre-soap era. Your eyes are like stars, your smile lights up the room, but perhaps step back a little when you whisper sweet nothings. Foot care was also crucial, especially in societies where people walked long distances in open footwear or none at all. Foot baths, often with added herbs or salts, were common. It's easier to keep hands and feet relatively clean than the entire body, given the logistics of water and fuel. These were often the first areas people would focus on when limited resources were available. A quick hand and face wash might be daily, a full body wash much less frequent. The methods used weren't just about removing visible dirt, they were also about managing the feeling of being clean. Rubbing with oils, scraping with a strigil, using powders, these processes could make the skin feel smoother and less gritty, even if they weren't chemically removing grime. The act of grooming itself was important, providing a sense of freshness and order in a world that could often feel chaotic and dirty. Consider how this impacts flirting. If everyone's baseline level of clean is significantly lower than what we're used to, then subtle differences become more significant. Someone who made the effort to use fragrant oils, scrape diligently with their strigil, and perhaps use herbal mouthwash would stand out, not just for their possibly slightly fresher smell, but for the effort they put in. This effort signaled status, access to resources, and perhaps a level of personal discipline. In a world without mass-produced soap, personal grooming was a more deliberate, resource-intensive act. Showing up to a potential romantic encounter smelling like you just spent an hour with your oil and strigil kit was the ancient equivalent of turning up in a perfectly ironed shirt and smelling subtly of expensive cologne. It said, I care enough about this interaction in myself to put in the work. The quirky tidbit here is the use of animal fats mixed with ash or alkali, not just for cleaning, but sometimes as cosmetics or hair treatments. Think rendered animal fat worked into the hair. While it might have helped shape hair, the smell, well, let's just say it probably needed significant perfuming afterwards. But it shows the resourcefulness, using whatever materials were at hand, even if the results weren't exactly what we'd aim for today. Darling, your hair has such a lovely, beefy aroma tonight. Maybe not the opening line you're hoping for. So the ancient world's approach to cleanliness was a complex mosaic of oils, scraping, powders, plant extracts, sweat, and heavy perfuming. It was a system built on managing the inevitable, not eliminating it entirely. And this fundamental reality set the stage for how people presented themselves, how they interacted, and yes, how they tried to woo each other. It shifted the focus from simply being clean to being artfully presented, layered with sense, and perhaps demonstrating an investment in grooming that spoke volumes in a pre-soap economy. Flirting involved navigating the sensory landscape, where visual cues were accompanied by potent olfactory information, and where a successfully applied perfume might be just as important as a charming smile. So, you have navigated the challenges of pre-soap personal freshness. Perhaps you've successfully scraped off the oily grime with your strigil or artfully layered a heady perfume blend over your natural musk. You've done your best with the resources available to smell not necessarily clean by our standards, but perhaps less offensive than the general baseline, or at least interestingly different. But merely mitigating odor wasn't the only arrow in the ancient flirt's quiver. Far from it. Looking the part was just as, if not more, important than smelling it. In a world where absolute cleanliness was a luxury or a ritualistic act, appearance, clothing, adornment, and carefully crafted presentation stepped up as a primary language of attraction and social standing. You see, before you even got close enough to pick up on subtle scents, or not so subtle ones, you were judged on how you looked. Clothes weren't just about covering up or staying warm. They were billboards advertising your status, your wealth, your profession, and your intentions. Wearing certain fabrics, colors, or styles sent clear signals. Imagine trying to get noticed across a crowded ancient marketplace, full of noise, dust, and, yes, all those pre-soap smells. Your visual presentation had to cut through the sensory clutter. Let's talk fabric. The wealthy wore fine linen and silk, if they could get it, often imported and incredibly expensive. Sometimes dyed in vibrant, hard-to-produce colors like Tyrian purple, which was literally worth more than its weight in gold. Wearing purple screamed, I am rich, possibly royalty, definitely someone you want to impress. Coarser wool and undyed linen were the staples for most people. Wool, while warm and durable, holds on to smells like a champ, and washing it was a laborious process involving stale urine, a source of ammonia, which helps lift grease, or alkaline earths, followed by beating and drying. Linen was easier to wash and felt cooler in hot climates, but it wrinkled like nobody's business. So you might see someone in relatively clean, by ancient standards, perhaps slightly stained, but well-maintained wool, or someone in often washed, but permanently creased linen. Neither was quite the crisp, fresh look you'd expect today, but they were indicators. Mainstream historical fact, in many ancient societies like Rome, the type and color of clothing were strictly regulated by sumptuary laws, dictating who could wear what, further emphasizing clothes as a marker of status. Keeping these clothes presentable without easy washing was a challenge. Airing them out in the sun or smoke was common. Brushing off dirt and vermin was necessary. Fulling, a process involving cleaning cloth, often wool, by pounding it in water mixed with fuller's earth or urine, was done by specialized workers, fullers, not usually at home. So your everyday tunic or robe probably got a full cleaning maybe a few times a year, if you were lucky. In between, it was spot cleaning, brushing, and hoping for the best. Your best outfit for impressing someone might just be the one that had been most recently fulled and hadn't been worn for strenuous activity since. Beyond the basic garment, how you styled yourself was key. Hair was a major canvas for expression. Styles varied wildly by culture and era, from the elaborate braided wigs of Egypt, sometimes scented and adorned with jewels, to the carefully sculpted curls favored by Roman elites, achieved with hot irons and lots of pomade, likely oil or animal fat based again. Men often wore their hair shorter in some periods, longer and bearded in others. Keeping hair clean was tricky without shampoo. Oils helped manage it but could also make it greasy quickly. Powdering hair with fragrant substances or even colored dust was common to absorb oil and add scent. Think of it as ancient, dry shampoo, potentially containing lead. What could go wrong? A quirky tidbit: Roman women famously used pigeon dung, among other questionable ingredients, to lighten their hair. Yes, pigeon dung. Suddenly modern bleach doesn't sound so bad, does it? Facial hair also came and went in fashion. A clean-shaven face might signal youth or military discipline, as with Roman soldiers, while a beard could signify wisdom, status, like Greek philosophers, or mourning. Maintaining a shave required sharp bronze or iron razors and skilled hands, potentially your own or a barber's. Nicks and cuts were common. It wasn't the quick, painless ritual of a modern safety razor. Cosmetics were another powerful tool in the ancient arsenal of attraction, used by both women and men, though often more extensively by women. Eyes were often emphasized. Egyptian kohl, made from ground minerals like galena, was used to line the eyes not just for beauty, but also believed to protect against the sun's glare and ward off evil spirits. It gave the eyes a dark, dramatic look. Roman women used kohl, but also eyeshadows in greens, blues, and reds, made from ground minerals. Lips and cheeks were rouged using plant dyes or mineral pigments like red ochre or cinnabar, which contains mercury. Yikes. Skin whitening was a common practice in many cultures, achieved with powders or pastes made from chalk, lead carbonate, again, very toxic, or other substances signifying leisure and indoor living, i.e., not being a manual laborer tanned by the sun. The goal wasn't always a natural look. Sometimes it was about creating an idealized, almost mask-like appearance, signifying status, health, even if artificial, and adherence to beauty standards that might seem alien to us. Applying makeup was a skill, often done with bronze mirrors, which gave a dimmer reflection than glass, bone or ivory applicators, and tiny pots of pigments. Imagine trying to get a perfect winged eyeliner using a reflective bronze disc and a pointed stick in dim oil lamplight. It puts your morning routine struggles into perspective, doesn't it? Adornment through jewelry and accessories was perhaps the most overt display of wealth and status. Gold, silver, bronze, and later glass and precious or semi-precious stones were crafted into rings, bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and fibulae, fancy brooches used to fasten clothing. The size, material, and craftsmanship of your jewelry spoke volumes. Wearing heavy gold bracelets or rings dripping with carved gems immediately marked you as someone of means. These weren't just pretty trinkets, they were portable wealth and social identifiers. Even simpler accessories like a finely made belt buckle or a decorative hairpin could signal attention to detail and perhaps a little disposable income. Other forms of body modification existed too, depending on the culture. Tattoos were practiced in various ancient societies, from the Egyptians to the Picts in Britain, often for religious reasons, tribal identity, or social status. Piercings were also present, though perhaps not as ubiquitous as some modern trends, with ear piercing being common in many places for both men and women. These permanent or semi-permanent modifications were also part of how people presented themselves and signaled identity. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for ancient beauty practices was attraction, social conformity, religious belief, or magical protection. It's likely a blend, varying by context. Wearing kohl in Egypt probably had religious and protective significance alongside its aesthetic appeal. Roman hairstyles might signify marital status or rank. Greek ideals of physical beauty were tied to philosophy and the divine. So, while certainly aimed at making oneself more appealing to potential mates, these practices were embedded in a complex web of cultural meanings. You weren't just trying to look hot, you were trying to look appropriately you within your social context, which in turn made you desirable to suitable partners. Consider the effort involved in all of this. Maintaining elaborate hairstyles, applying complex cosmetics, keeping relatively clean and presentable clothing. This wasn't trivial. It required time, resources, and often the help of servants if you were wealthy enough to afford them. A woman with intricate braids and heavy makeup wasn't just showing off her face, she was showing off her leisure time and access to skilled help. A man in a carefully draped, expensive wool toga indicated he wasn't engaged in manual labor. These visual cues were potent signals of eligibility, stability, and desirability in a world where life could be harsh and uncertain. The quirky tidbit about pigeon dung hair dye is just one example of the lengths people went to for beauty, often with dangerous consequences. Lead in cosmetics caused lead poisoning. Mercury in cinnabar was toxic. Some depilatories contained harsh chemicals that could burn the skin. The pursuit of beauty, it seems, has always involved a degree of risk and discomfort. Imagine explaining to your crush why your eyebrows have suddenly fallen off after trying a new depilatory paste. It's a look, very avant-garde. So when you were looking to attract someone in the ancient world, your personal presentation went far beyond whether you had managed to scrape off most of yesterday's sweat and oil. It was about the fabric of your tunic, the way your hair was styled, the glint of gold at your neck, the dark line around your eyes, the whiteness, or careful coloring, of your skin. You were crafting an image, layering visual signals just as you might layer perfumes. This intricate dance of appearance set the stage for interaction, communicating status, health, and effort before a single word was exchanged or a hand gesture made. It was a silent language of attraction, spoken through wool, linen, gold, coal, and questionable hair treatments. And understanding this visual grammar was essential if you wanted to move from merely observing someone to actually attempting to connect. So you've put in the effort. You've managed to address the aroma situation as best you could with oil, scraping, or perfume. You've adorned yourself in the finest fabrics you could acquire or keep clean, perhaps applied some striking kohl around your eyes or a splash of rouge to your cheeks. Styled your hair just so. You look the part. You smell potentially interesting. The stage is set. Now what? How do you actually connect with that intriguing person across the dusty street, the bustling marketplace, or the dimly lit hall? This is where the silent conversation begins. The one conducted not with words, but with glances, postures, and subtle movements. In societies where direct conversation between unrelated men and women might be restricted or socially complex, or even between people of different statuses, nonverbal communication became an incredibly sophisticated language. It was a way to signal interest, availability, or even rejection without uttering a single potentially embarrassing or inappropriate word. You had to be a master of the unspoken, a virtuoso of the visible. The eyes, of course, were paramount. The power of a gaze, even in antiquity, was undeniable. Meeting someone's eyes and holding the gaze for just a moment longer than strictly necessary could convey volumes. Was it a casual glance or something more? A prolonged look could signal daring interest, perhaps even a challenge. Looking away quickly could indicate shyness, modesty, or a deliberate lack of interest. Stealing repeated, fleeting glances from across a room was the ancient equivalent of liking someone's profile picture multiple times. A clear signal you were paying attention, perhaps hoping they'd notice you noticing them. But eye contact was tricky. In some cultures, particularly for women of certain social standing, direct, sustained eye contact with strangers was considered immodest, even provocative. So the game involved nuance. It wasn't always about staring. It was about how you looked, when you looked, and for how long. A lowered gaze could be traditional and respectful, but combined with a slight smile or a blush, it could become an invitation. A quick flicker of the eyes upwards before dropping them again, a signal that they had been seen, appreciated, and acknowledged, all while maintaining an outward appearance of decorum. Imagine the stress. You had to calculate glance duration like a pro athlete calculates trajectory. Get it wrong and you might appear rude, forward, or simply uninterested. No pressure, right? Beyond the eyes, your entire body was broadcasting signals. Posture spoke volumes about your confidence and your social standing. Standing tall, shoulders back, head held high, conveyed authority and self-assurance, qualities often attractive. Slouching, on the other hand, might suggest subservience, ill health, or simply a lack of spirit. If you were trying to catch someone's eye, you weren't going to do it hunched over like you were trying to find a dropped coin in the dirt, even if you were trying to find a dropped coin. How you oriented your body also mattered. Turning your body slightly towards someone you found interesting, even while appearing to talk to someone else, was a subtle way of directing your attention towards them. Facing someone directly could be seen as bold or confrontational, depending on the context, while positioning yourself at an angle felt more relaxed and approachable. Even mundane actions became part of the nonverbal script. The way you walked, a confident stride versus a hesitant shuffle, communicated something about your character. The way you handled objects, fiddling nervously with your belt or jewelry, or gesturing broadly with your hands, added layers to the silent conversation. Hands themselves were important. Keeping them visible was generally a sign of trustworthiness, while hidden hands could be suspicious. Specific hand gestures could have widely understood meanings, from warding off evil, like the mano cornuta, the horn gesture still used today in Italy, though perhaps with a different primary meaning, to offering a blessing. Subtler gestures were the true poetry of ancient flirtation. A slight tilt of the head could signal interest and attentiveness. A nervous adjustment of clothing, perhaps a fold of your toga or the edge of your mantle, could betray excitement. Women might use fans or veils not just for cooling or covering, but to strategically reveal or conceal, drawing attention to their eyes or face at opportune moments. A demure smile, a playful glance from behind a veil. These were highly effective tools in the ancient coquette's arsenal. A quirky tidbit: in Roman pantomime, actors relied entirely on body language and codified gestures to tell stories, showing just how developed and understood nonverbal communication could be in ancient society. Imagine trying to convey "I fancy you" solely through interpretive dance and eyebrow wiggles. It required skill and maybe a good sense of humor if it went wrong. Blushing, that involuntary crimson tide, was a universally recognized signal, often interpreted as a sign of modesty, innocence, or genuine emotion. If you saw someone blush as you caught their eye, it was a pretty good indicator your silent overture had been received and might be welcome. Of course, it could also mean they were utterly mortified you had noticed them, which is its own kind of signal, I suppose. Let's not forget the environment. Imagine trying to execute these subtle, nonverbal cues in a crowded, noisy Roman bathhouse, steaming and echoing, where visibility is limited and personal space is non-existent, or in the packed stands of the Colosseum, surrounded by tens of thousands of yelling spectators and the distinct smells we discussed earlier. It took focus and determination to send and receive these signals amidst the chaos of ancient life. You had to really want to communicate, to filter out the noise and the musk and the general hullabaloo to notice that specific tilt of a head or that lingering glance. Different cultures had different nonverbal grammars. What was acceptable or inviting in Ptolemaic Egypt, where women often had more freedom and visibility, might be scandalously forward in classical Athens, where respectable women were largely confined to the home. Roman gestures could be quite dramatic, influenced by oratory and performance. Greek ideals of physical form influenced how people presented themselves. Mainstream historical fact: orators in Rome were explicitly trained in gesture, recognizing its power to sway an audience, demonstrating how conscious and developed the understanding of body language was. You were essentially performing your desirability. Historians still argue whether the specific meanings of many ancient gestures were universally understood across social classes and regions, or if they were more like in-jokes, recognizable only to those in the know. And was that particular hand movement just scratching an itch, or was it a coded message? Was that prolonged stare aggressive, appreciative, or simply someone lost in thought? Interpreting these signals centuries later from art or limited text is a fascinating and often speculative challenge. You can look at a Roman fresco and see people interacting, but are they flirting, negotiating, or arguing? The debate continues. The pressure was on. In a world with fewer ways to connect and potentially higher stakes, marriage, social advancement, mastering the silent art of attraction was essential. You couldn't just swipe right. You had to deploy your carefully curated appearance, manage your aroma situation, and then engage in a delicate, high-stakes dance of nonverbal communication. It was like playing charades, but the prize was maybe getting to talk to them, or at least receiving a reciprocal glance that let you know you hadn't completely embarrassed yourself. Think about the practice it must have taken. Standing in front of that dim bronze mirror, practicing your casual glance, your interested tilt, your modest blush. Okay, maybe not the blush, but you could certainly practice the lowered gaze. Trying to perfect the art of looking simultaneously approachable and yet suitably distant. It required a certain theatricality, a willingness to perform attractiveness for an audience of one. And sometimes you'd get it wrong. You'd hold a gaze too long and get a scandalized look in return. You'd tilt your head and get met with confusion. You'd blush and they'd think you were just overheated. The potential for misinterpretation was vast, adding another layer of complexity to the whole endeavor. It was a bit like trying to communicate using only emojis from a flip phone. Limited options, high chance of misunderstanding. This subtle nonverbal interplay was the bridge between merely observing someone and initiating contact. It was the way you tested the waters, sent out feelers, and hopefully got a positive response that indicated the next step was welcome. It was quiet, it was nuanced, and it was absolutely critical in navigating the social landscapes of the ancient world where loud declarations or bold approaches might be entirely out of the question. You had to charm them with your bearing, intrigue them with your eyes, and signal your interest with a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible to anyone else. It required a deep understanding of the social rules, a keen eye for detail, and maybe just a little bit of luck. And if your silent signals were successful, perhaps, just perhaps, you might find yourself moving closer towards a moment where actual words might be exchanged. Or perhaps a different kind of physical interaction might begin. You've navigated the complex landscape of silent glances, calculated postures, and the subtle language of the body. You've sent your signals across the crowded room or the dusty marketplace, hoping they landed softly and weren't entirely misunderstood. Perhaps you saw that quick drop of the eyes followed by a blush or a slight turn of the head in your direction. These tiny acknowledgments are victories in themselves, but the goal often was to move closer, to bridge that physical gap. And in that progression, physical touch, even the most fleeting or indirect, held immense power. Now, before you conjure up images of passionate embraces or anything remotely resembling modern public displays of affection, let's pump the brakes hard. In most ancient societies we're exploring, norms around physical contact, especially between unmarried or unrelated individuals, were vastly different from today. Public touch was heavily regulated by custom, law, and social expectation. A wrong move wasn't just awkward, it could be deeply offensive, ruin reputations, or even lead to serious consequences. So this wasn't about casual high fives or a friendly arm squeeze. This was high-stakes, low-key contact. Think of the accidental touch. In crowded public spaces, the forum, the marketplace, the bustling street, a cramped tavern, incidental contact was almost inevitable. Shoulders might brush, hands might accidentally meet reaching for the same piece of fruit or coin. How you reacted to this accident was part of the flirting game. Did you recoil sharply, signaling disdain or strict adherence to propriety? Or did the touch linger for a fraction of a second longer? Did you meet their eyes with a startled, perhaps slightly flustered look that wasn't entirely negative? This brief, seemingly unintentional contact could be a test, a tiny probe into the other person's reaction, offering a glimpse of potential openness or rigid reserve. It's the ancient world's equivalent of accidentally swiping right on someone you know in real life and then having to deal with it. Uncomfortable, but maybe a sign from the universe. Beyond the truly accidental, there was the conveniently accidental. Oh dear, you stumbled slightly on the uneven pavement, and your hand reached out to steady yourself, just happening to brush against their arm. Or perhaps you were passing a narrow stall, and you had to squeeze past, resulting in a brief, unavoidable brush. These required a certain amount of choreography and plausible deniability. You couldn't just ram into them. That would be aggressive and weird. It had to look natural, like a simple consequence of the environment. Mastering the oops, sorry, didn't see you there light touch required practice, timing, and maybe a bit of luck that the cobblestones were cooperating. Consider interactions involving objects, passing something between you, a coin for a purchase, a piece of fabric at a market, a cup of wine at a social gathering. The moment your fingers brushed as the object exchanged hands could be charged with subtle meaning. Was the touch fleeting and strictly functional? Or was there a slight pause, a brief, almost imperceptible pressure? This form of contact was often socially permissible because it was tied to a necessary transaction or interaction, but it provided a narrow window for a tiny, suggestive physical connection. Imagine the tension of passing a clay tablet, the ancient world's email, and hoping their fingers brush yours for just a moment too long. Riveting stuff. Then there was touch related to assistance or shared activity, which offered more legitimate excuses for contact. Helping someone navigate a difficult path, assisting them onto a cart or boat, adjusting their clothing or hair if something was askew, only appropriate in very specific, often formal or pre-existing relationships, mind you. Or even just being in close proximity during a shared task like grinding grain or fetching water. These situations could involve brief, seemingly innocent touches, a guiding hand on the elbow, a supportive arm momentarily, a careful adjustment of a cloak. The key was the intent behind the touch and the reciprocal reaction. Was the assistance truly needed, or was it offered just for the opportunity for contact? Did the person receiving the touch lean into it slightly, or stiffen and pull away? These moments were pregnant with unspoken possibility. Let's talk about specific body parts. Hands were often the most available for socially permissible touch. Handshakes existed in various forms across different cultures, though their meaning and frequency varied. A handshake could be purely formal, a sign of agreement or greeting. But could it be extended slightly? Could the grip be held a moment longer? Could a thumb gently brush the back of the other's hand? These were subtle variations on a standard gesture that could carry significant weight. Helping someone up, offering a hand for support, these were legitimate interactions that could be imbued with flirtatious undertones through execution. Arms and shoulders might be brushed against or briefly touched for guidance or support in crowded spaces. But touching someone's face, hair, or upper body, chest, back in public was generally far more intimate and often taboo unless within familial or marital contexts. This made the rare, brief, accidental touch of a shoulder or arm even more significant. It was a boundary tested, a line carefully crossed, often with a built-in excuse. Clothing itself could be a medium for touch, not touching the person directly, but their attire. Gently brushing lint off someone's shoulder, again, context is everything here, commenting on the texture of their fabric and briefly touching it, or helping adjust a sash or cloak. This was a step removed from touching the skin, and thus often safer socially, but it still created a physical connection, drawing attention to the other person's presence and your focus on them. Imagine admiring the weave of their linen tunic and letting your fingers linger just a touch too long on the fabric. It's not quite holding hands, but it's definitely saying something. Mainstream historical fact: in Roman society, hand-holding between men and women was a common visual motif in art depicting marriage or betrothal, known as dextrarum uncio, onistum, joining of the right hands. While this specific gesture was linked to formal union, it highlights that hand contact was recognized as a significant form of physical connection, reinforcing how powerful even hand touch could be in less formal but suggestive contexts. It wasn't just a casual thing, it was meaningful. Different societies had different rules. In some cultures, women were heavily veiled or kept largely out of public view, making any physical contact with unrelated men almost impossible and strictly forbidden. In others, like perhaps certain segments of Egyptian society or during specific festivals in Greece or Rome, there might be more license for interaction and even touch, though still within understood limits. The context of religious festivals, Dionysian rites, or communal baths, while keeping hygiene in mind, could create temporary spaces where social restrictions were slightly loosened, allowing for more daring forms of physical interaction, though still risky. The intention behind the touch was paramount and often interpreted through the surrounding nonverbal cues we discussed in the previous section. Was the touch firm or gentle, quick or lingering, accompanied by a smile, a blush, or averted eyes? A gentle, brief touch of the hand while passing an object, combined with a warm glance, could be a clear invitation. A firm, lingering grasp accompanied by intense staring might be seen as overly aggressive or inappropriate. It was a subtle dialect of desire. Quirky tidbit. In some ancient cultures, touching a specific object associated with a person, like their jewelry or a ribbon from their hair, if such things were exchanged or displayed, could be seen as a symbolic form of touching the person themselves, carrying a strong romantic or even magical connotation. It was like touching a piece of them, an indirect but potent connection. Historians still argue whether seemingly innocuous acts of touch in ancient art or literature were purely functional descriptions, or whether they were understood by contemporary audiences as carrying subtle romantic or sexual undertones. When a poet describes someone adjusting their lover's cloak, is it just detailing the scene, or is it hinting at the intimacy and permissible touch within that relationship? Deciphering the language of ancient touch is tricky because our modern lens often imposes different interpretations of physical contact. Was that touch just politeness, or was it more? The element of risk made these small touches potent. For a woman of good reputation in many societies, allowing any unauthorized physical contact could be damaging. For a man, initiating touch inappropriately could lead to public shaming, conflict with family members, or accusations of disrespect. This meant that when a touch did happen, and when it was met with a receptive response rather than rejection, it was a significant step. It broke a barrier, established a physical connection, however brief, and signaled a willingness to move beyond purely visual or verbal interaction. Consider the social dances that existed. While not necessarily flirtation, some forms of communal dance in ancient Greece or Rome involved degrees of physical contact, holding hands or moving in close proximity. These structured interactions provided sanctioned opportunities for touch, where participants could gauge compatibility and interest within a seemingly innocent activity. It was like a controlled environment for physical connection, like a very formal square dance where everyone is also wearing slightly questionable body oil. Even the act of giving or receiving a gift involved touch, the hands meeting as the object changed ownership, the recipient holding something the giver had held. These weren't direct touches of the person, but they linked individuals through a shared object, warm from their skin, carrying their scent, or lack thereof, depending on the hygiene situation that day. It was an indirect physical echo. The power of touch in ancient flirtation wasn't about grand gestures. It was in the micro moments, the brush of fingers over rough pottery, the brief contact of hands over a smooth stone, the careful adjustment of a heavy fold of fabric. It was subtle, often ambiguous, and entirely reliant on context and mutual interpretation. It required incredible sensitivity to gauge whether a situation allowed for even the slightest physical contact, and whether that contact would be welcomed or rejected. You had to read the room, read the person, and execute your move with precision and plausible deniability. And if your subtle touch was met with a positive signal, a return glance, a slight smile, a failure to immediately recoil, it was a powerful affirmation. It meant the silent conversation had progressed, the nonverbal signals were aligning, and there was potential for more. It was the physical equivalent of getting a tiny spark when you were just hoping to rub two sticks together. A small beginning, but one that held the promise of warmth. It wasn't easy, it wasn't overt, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed, but in the carefully controlled world of ancient social interaction, the power of a single, perfectly timed, subtle touch could be immense. It could ignite interest, break down invisible barriers, and pave the way for deeper connection. Assuming, of course, all the other nonverbal cues were also pointing in the right direction. So you've exchanged glances, held a posture just a beat too long, perhaps even managed a carefully orchestrated, plausibly deniable accidental touch that wasn't immediately met with horrified recoil. The air, however stale from lack of soap, is starting to feel a little less stagnant. The unspoken conversation has reached a point where silence might start to feel awkward, or where you need to move beyond the purely physical and visual to see if there's any connection on a deeper level. This is where the voice comes in. This is where you finally talk. Bridging the gap from silent observer or subtle toucher to engaging in actual conversation with someone you're interested in was and remains a significant step. It required opportunity, courage, and social permission. Depending on the society and context, this might happen during a structured social event, a chance encounter in a public space where conversation was acceptable, or perhaps through an intermediary who facilitated an introduction. It wasn't often as simple as just walking up and saying, "Hey, nice tunic," especially not across significant social divides or gender lines. But when the opportunity arose, the spoken word became your primary tool. Forget the smooth pickup lines of modern dating apps. Not that they're always smooth now, let's be honest. Ancient flirting talk was often more formal, more indirect, and deeply embedded in cultural norms about politeness, wit, and social hierarchy. What constituted effective flirting conversation varied wildly. Were you expected to be charming and witty, respectful and deferential, bold and direct? It all depended on where and who you were. Let's consider the simplest form, the compliment. A genuine compliment, delivered sincerely, could be a powerful opener or a way to signal interest. But you couldn't just say anything. Compliments often focused on qualities valued by the society. Beauty, within specific, often rigid standards. Grace, skill at a particular task, like weaving or rhetoric. Wisdom, virtue, or lineage. You might praise the way someone moved, the sparkle in their eyes, perhaps enhanced by a bit of kohl, the elegance of their simple adornment, or their clever response to a question. Delivery was everything. Was the compliment whispered conspiratorially, spoken clearly for others to hear, perhaps to signal your intentions publicly, or delivered with a shy glance? A clumsy or inappropriate compliment could easily backfire, marking you as boorish or disrespectful. Praising the wrong thing, or praising it in the wrong way, could shut down the conversation faster than you can say fermented fish sauce. Then there was wit and banter. In many ancient cultures, particularly in urban centers like Athens or Rome, a sharp mind and a quick tongue were highly valued. Engaging in playful teasing, witty repartee, or clever wordplay could be a sophisticated form of flirting. It showed intelligence, confidence, and the ability to engage on an intellectual level. Think of the dialogues in Plato, where philosophical points are sometimes intertwined with personal interactions, though perhaps slightly less overtly flirty than we're imagining. This wasn't about making crude jokes or putting someone down. It was about a lighthearted exchange that showed you could keep up, that you were observant, and that you found the interaction enjoyable. It was a dance of words, testing boundaries gently, creating a shared sense of amusement, and perhaps even a little bit of intimacy through shared laughter. Imagine trying to impress someone with your knowledge of obscure Roman gods while simultaneously making a subtle joke about the quality of the local wine. Highbrow flirting indeed. Poetry played a significant role, especially among the more educated classes. Composing and sharing poems or quoting famous verses was a common way to express emotions and desires, often in coded or metaphorical language. Love poetry in particular provided a rich vocabulary for expressing attraction, longing, and admiration without necessarily being overtly direct. A man might compose a short poem praising a woman's beauty and subtly referencing his own feelings, perhaps leaving it somewhere she might find it or reciting it in a setting where she could hear. A woman might respond with her own verses, perhaps more guarded, but indicating whether the sentiment was welcome or not. Think of Sappho's fragments, full of raw emotion and desire, which, while often discussed in academic contexts, certainly reflect a culture where intense personal feelings found expression through verse. It's a bit more effort than sending a "you up" text, I'll grant you, but potentially more romantic. Sharing existing poetry was also common. Quoting lines from famous poets that seemed to speak to your current situation or feelings could convey a depth of emotion and shared cultural understanding. It showed you were educated and sensitive, capable of appreciating beauty and articulating complex feelings through established artistic forms. Oh, those lines from Catullus? They just perfectly capture this moment. Subtle glance. Requests and offers could also be framed flirtatiously. Offering assistance with a task, asking for a small favor that created an opportunity for interaction, or proposing a shared activity like attending a festival or visiting a temple together could be thinly veiled invitations for further connection. Allow me to carry that heavy water amphora for you. Could be simple politeness, or it could be a bid for shared physical proximity and conversation. Would you perhaps be attending the performance at the theater next week? I find it so much more enjoyable with congenial company. The use of intermediaries was incredibly common and often necessary, particularly for women in more restricted societies. A trusted servant, a friend, a relative, or even a professional go-between could carry messages, deliver small tokens, or facilitate meetings and conversations. This allowed for a degree of indirectness and protection, enabling flirting to occur without the man and woman necessarily having direct, unsupervised contact. The intermediary had to be discreet, loyal, and skilled in conveying subtle messages, essentially the ancient world's WhatsApp group chat, but with more sandals. Mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece and Rome, public speaking and rhetoric were highly valued skills, and a man's ability to speak well could be a significant asset in various aspects of life, including attracting a partner. Being eloquent, witty, and knowledgeable in conversation was considered a sign of intelligence and good breeding, and thus attractive. This wasn't just about formal speeches, it applied to social interactions too. Consider the context of social gatherings, feasts, symposia, drinking parties, often with philosophical discussion and entertainment, religious festivals, and public baths, again, depending heavily on the culture and era, provided sanctioned spaces for people to mix and talk. While the primary purpose might be something else, these were prime opportunities for verbal flirting. Conversation flowed more freely, social hierarchies might be slightly relaxed, though rarely entirely absent, and there were built-in topics of conversation related to the event itself. During a symposium, for instance, witty banter, philosophical debate, which could certainly involve intellectual sparring that might be attractive, poetry recitation, and even playful challenges were common. This environment was ripe for verbal flirting, allowing individuals to showcase their intelligence, charm, and social grace. Oh, Socrates, your argument is as persuasive as your eyes are, sparkling. Might be pushing it slightly, but you get the idea. Historians still argue whether the highly stylized and often elaborate language used in ancient love poetry and other texts reflected actual everyday flirting conversations, or if it was a more idealized or literary representation. Did ordinary people really quote Homer or compose intricate verses on the fly to express interest? Or was everyday flirting talk more pragmatic, focused on practicalities mixed with simple compliments and observations? It's hard to know how much was high art and how much was just trying to make someone laugh. Quirky tidbit. In some cultures, like ancient Egypt, love spells and charms often included written elements intended to influence someone's feelings. While not conversation in the traditional sense, the text of these spells sometimes contain phrases or sentiments that reveal what kind of verbal declarations or desires were associated with the attraction, offering a glimpse into the language of longing, albeit through a magical lens. Imagine trying to find a spell that made someone think your jokes were funny. The key to successful verbal flirting was often subtlety and ambiguity, much like the nonverbal signals. You wanted to convey interest without being overly forward or risking embarrassment if the interest wasn't reciprocated. Using layered meanings, gentle irony, and leaving things slightly unsaid allowed for plausible deniability. That necklace suits you beautifully. It truly highlights the color of your eyes, a color I find quite striking. It's a compliment, but it's also pointing out that you've noticed their eyes specifically. Humor, as always, could be a powerful tool. Making someone laugh created a positive connection and showed you had a lighthearted side. Ancient jokes might not always land with a modern audience. They often involved obscure historical figures or cultural references, but the intent to amuse and entertain was a universal form of attraction. A shared laugh could dissolve awkwardness and create a sense of rapport far more effectively than dry compliments. Consider how different verbal styles would appeal. Were you attracted to the person who spoke with authority and confidence, or the one who was softer spoken and more gentle? The one who used complex language and philosophical references, or the one who was more down-to-earth and practical? Your own speaking style and preferences would also influence how you engaged in this verbal dance. It was about finding a rhythm and a connection in conversation. Ending the conversation was also part of the art. You didn't want to overstay your welcome, but you also wanted to leave a positive impression and perhaps create an opening for future interaction. A graceful departure, perhaps with a final compliment or a hopeful reference to meeting again, "I hope our paths cross again soon," was crucial. You had to leave them wanting more, not wondering when you would finally leave. Ultimately, moving into verbal communication was a significant escalation in the flirting process. It allowed for a deeper exchange than could be achieved through looks or touches alone. It moved the interaction from the realm of potential to the realm of actual connection, however tentative. It required you to engage your mind and your voice, to be present and responsive, and to navigate the complex social rules governing speech between interested parties. It was like finally moving from interpretive dance to actually speaking your lines in the play, hoping you didn't forget your cue or trip over the set. And if the conversation went well, if the wit landed, the compliments were received positively, and the shared laughter created a comfortable space, then you had successfully navigated another delicate stage of ancient attraction. The verbal exchange solidified the earlier nonverbal signals and subtle touches, building a foundation for potential future interactions. It was a crucial step in turning a fleeting glance or a brief touch into something that might, just might, blossom into something more. So, the words have been exchanged. You navigated the delicate dance of verbal flirting, perhaps with wit, perhaps with charm, perhaps just by managing not to say anything truly disastrous. A connection has been forged, tentative but real. The subtle glances turned into acknowledged conversations, the accidental touches into perhaps a lingering hand on an arm. But what happens when the immediate interaction ends? When you part ways and the humdrum reality of daily life, with its demands and distances, returns? How do you keep that spark alive, build upon it, or escalate your intentions when you can't be physically present, subtly raising an eyebrow or delivering a perfectly timed, witty remark? This is where the tangible comes into play, the written word and the small token. Moving beyond face-to-face interaction often required something more concrete, something that could travel across space and time, carrying your thoughts, feelings, and intentions when you couldn't. For many, this meant letters. Now, writing a letter wasn't quite as simple as whipping out a stylus and tapping away on a clay tablet, though that was a form of written communication used in some early societies. Depending on the era and location, literacy rates could be incredibly low. Writing was a skill often limited to scribes, merchants, priests, and the wealthy elite. So, for a large portion of the population, sending a love letter wasn't even an option unless you could afford to pay someone to write it for you, which added a layer of formality and potentially reduced the raw, immediate expression of emotion. Imagine having to dictate your deepest romantic feelings to a bored-looking scribe with a bad cough. And then tell her my heart, splutter, pounds like a blacksmith's hammer. Not quite the same vibe. But for those who could write or could afford someone who could, letters became a powerful tool in the arsenal of attraction. A letter allowed for careful composition. You could draft and redraft your words, polishing your compliments, perfecting your expressions of longing, and crafting arguments for why you were a desirable match. Unlike spoken words, which vanish into the air, a letter was permanent. It could be reread, cherished, debated, and even used as evidence, for good or ill. The content of these letters varied wildly. They could be highly formal, couched in polite, even flowery language, adhering strictly to social conventions, or they could be surprisingly intimate and passionate, depending on the relationship, the individuals, and the cultural norms around expressing emotion in writing. Some letters might be short and to the point, arranging a meeting. Others might be long, rambling epistles detailing every thought and feeling. Poetry, again, could feature heavily, either quoted or original compositions, allowing for metaphorical expressions of desire that might be too bold to say directly. Think of the famous or infamous love letters from history or literature. While many surviving examples come from the literate elite, they give us a window into the possibilities of written romantic communication. Ovid, the Roman poet, even wrote an instructional poem, Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, which, among other things, offered advice on writing love letters, suggesting they be persuasive, full of promises, and express vulnerability. Maybe don't mention that time you got food poisoning from questionable street food. Letters often serve multiple purposes. They could express feelings, yes, but also arrange future meetings, discuss family matters, relevant if marriage was the goal, share news, or simply maintain contact over distance. Receiving a letter was an event. It meant someone had put effort and resources into reaching out to you specifically. The material itself, papyrus, parchment, ostraka, pottery shards for less formal notes, wax tablets, could also carry meaning. A letter on fine parchment might signify serious intent and high status, while a quick scratch on a wax tablet could be more casual. Delivery was another hurdle. Letters rarely traveled quickly or reliably. They depended on messengers, sometimes personal servants, sometimes hired carriers, sometimes friends or relatives traveling in the right direction. The speed of communication was dictated by foot, animal, or sail. Waiting for a reply could take days, weeks, or even months. This waiting period itself added a layer of anticipation and significance. Every arrival of a potential messenger would send a ripple of excitement or anxiety. Did they send something back? This brings us to the use of intermediaries again. Just as with spoken communication, a messenger wasn't just a delivery service. They were often part of the communication itself. They might carry verbal messages alongside the written one, explain nuances, or even gauge the recipient's reaction to report back. They had to be trustworthy, as the contents of a love letter could be highly personal and potentially damaging if revealed. Sharing your deepest feelings only for the message to end up circulating amongst the local gossips would be inconvenient, to say the least. Beyond letters, tokens and gifts played a vital role. A gift is a physical manifestation of intent, a tangible reminder of the giver and their interest. It's harder to ignore a physical object than to simply forget a conversation. Gifts could range from the practical to the purely symbolic. What constituted an appropriate gift varied greatly by culture and social status. For the wealthy, it might be jewelry, a ring, a necklace, earrings. These weren't just adornments, they could be symbols of wealth, status, and commitment. A ring, for instance, could signify betrothal in some cultures. Giving a piece of personal jewelry might carry significant emotional weight. For those of lesser means, gifts might be simpler but no less meaningful. A flower, a piece of fruit, especially a rare or prized one, a small carved object, a piece of fabric, or something handmade. The act of giving the gift was as important as the gift itself. Was it given directly, with shy eyes and a nervous hand, or delivered by an intermediary, adding a layer of formality and mystery? Was it given publicly, signaling intent to the community, or privately, emphasizing the personal nature of the connection? Receiving a gift created an obligation. At the very least, an obligation to acknowledge it, and potentially an obligation to reciprocate or signal acceptance of the giver's intentions. Declining a gift, especially one given formally or publicly, was a clear rejection. Consider the symbolism embedded in gifts. Certain flowers might convey specific meanings. A piece of fruit could symbolize fertility or desire. A handmade object showed effort and personal investment. Even practical gifts could be imbued with meaning. Providing something needed could demonstrate care and capability. Think about giving someone a finely crafted comb or a bolt of good linen. Useful, yes, but also hinting at a desire for their well-being and presentation. Sometimes the gift was less about inherent value and more about its personal connection to the giver. Perhaps it was something they had made themselves, something they had owned and cherished, or something they had gone out of their way to obtain. Such gifts spoke of personal sacrifice and focused attention, which could be incredibly flattering. Receiving a small, unique item that you knew the giver had put thought or effort into felt very different from receiving something generic. It was a piece of them. Letters and tokens often went hand in hand. A letter might accompany a gift, explaining its significance or expressing the feelings that prompted it. A gift might be sent as a follow-up to a letter, reinforcing the message or signifying impatience for a reply. They work together to create a multi-sensory appeal: the sight and feel of the gift, the sight and words of the letter. Historians still argue whether the extravagant descriptions of gifts and love tokens in surviving ancient literature, like epic poems or romantic novels from the Roman period, reflect actual common practice among all social classes, or if they represent an idealized version of courtship primarily limited to the wealthy elite. Did ordinary people really exchange elaborate jewelry and lengthy poems, or was their flirting more practical, involving simpler gestures and gifts focused on necessity or communal activities? It's hard to extrapolate the experiences of the majority from the records left behind by the minority who could read, write, and afford lavish goods. Mainstream historical fact. In ancient Rome, the giving of a ring, annulus pronubis, was a significant step in betrothal, often given at a formal ceremony and worn on the left ring finger, believed to be connected directly to the heart by a vein, the vena amoris. While not solely a flirting act, it was a crucial milestone involving a tangible token that formalized attraction into a potential commitment. Quirky tidbit. In some ancient Egyptian love poems that have been translated from papyrus fragments, there are references to the beloved having eyes like semi-precious stones or skin like fine linen. While not a tangible gift itself, the language used reveals what qualities were prized and how material goods or precious items were used metaphorically to describe the beloved, perhaps influencing what kinds of tokens might have been considered desirable. Imagining their eyes as lapis lazuli might prompt the gift of a small piece of that stone. The significance of moving to letters and tokens was immense. It elevated the interaction beyond fleeting moments of conversation or subtle physical cues. It required effort, resources, and a level of commitment from the giver. It also created a lasting impression and a physical reminder for the recipient. Holding a letter, tracing the lines of the script, even if you needed help reading it, or wearing a gifted item kept the connection alive in absence. It showed seriousness of intent and a willingness to invest in the relationship. It was a step towards formal courtship, or at least a clear signal that you were thinking about the other person when they weren't right in front of you, which, let's be honest, is still a pretty effective flirting technique today. These tangible objects and written words built a bridge across the gaps in time and space that separated potential lovers in the ancient world. They allowed for a deeper, more complex expression of feeling and intention than simple glances or whispered words. They were not just objects, they were vessels carrying hope, desire, and vulnerability. And receiving one, whether a beautifully composed letter on fine paper or a simple hand-carved wooden bird, would undoubtedly cause a flutter in your chest, a tangible piece of evidence that the connection you felt might just be real. It was a significant escalation, transforming a potential flirtation into something more concrete, something you could hold on to. So you've sent the painstakingly crafted letter, maybe accompanied by a token that hopefully didn't look too much like something you just found lying around. Or perhaps you received one and it's sitting there, a tangible weight in your hand, a physical embodiment of someone's thoughts about you. The private exchanges have been made, but life wasn't lived solely within the confines of individual homes and secret messages. A massive part of interaction, including the subtle art of attraction, happened out there, in the bustling, sometimes chaotic, often very public world. Imagine stepping out of your dwelling into a world that smelled, well, let's just say it had a distinct aroma profile, a mix of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, animal waste, tanning hides, spilled drinks, maybe some incense trying its best, and whatever detritus happened to be underfoot. This was the backdrop against which much social interaction, including flirting, took place. Public spaces weren't just transit routes. They were vibrant, noisy hubs of activity. The marketplace, the forum, the agora, the town square, the wells or rivers where water was drawn, the public baths, religious temples or precincts, festivals, public games or performances. These were the arenas where you saw and were seen. Unlike the controlled environment of sending a letter or arranging a discreet meeting, flirting in public was a high-stakes, high-visibility game. You weren't just communicating with the object of your affection, you were performing in a way for everyone else present. Friends, family, neighbors, rivals, potential gossips. They were all potential witnesses. This added layers of complexity. You had to be careful not to be too overt, depending on the social norms and who was watching. A misinterpreted glance, a conversation that lingered too long, an exchange of gifts seen by the wrong person could lead to rumors, damage reputations, or even invite unwanted attention from people trying to control your actions, like parents or guardians. But the public space also offered opportunities unavailable in private. It allowed for repeated casual encounters. You might see the same person day after day at the market, allowing for a slow build of recognition and maybe a shared smile or a brief, polite exchange. These weren't planned dates, they were organic moments woven into the fabric of daily necessity. You had to go get grain or water, or perhaps try to offload that slightly lopsided pottery you made. And while doing so, bam, there they were. It turned mundane tasks into potential moments of connection. Suddenly, that trip to the public well felt less like a chore and more like a possibility. Festivals and public celebrations were particularly fertile ground for flirting. These events often temporarily relaxed some social strictures. Music, dancing, feasting, religious rituals. They created an atmosphere of heightened emotion and communal participation. People were often adorned in their best, or at least cleanest, clothes, perhaps wearing simple garlands or jewelry. There was a sense of collective energy that could make individual interactions feel less daunting. Think of a harvest festival. You're surrounded by people celebrating, perhaps sharing a food or drink, a shared laugh over a dropped piece of fruit, a hand briefly brushing yours during a dance, a lingering look across the crowd while the music plays. These moments, subtle yet charged, could happen more easily amidst the revelry. It was like the ancient world's version of a slightly awkward office holiday party, but with fewer staplers involved. Public baths, where they existed, like in Roman society, were another fascinating space. While potentially off-putting to modern sensibilities regarding hygiene and privacy, Roman baths were social hubs. They weren't just for getting clean, they were places for exercise, relaxation, gossip, business deals, and yes, flirting. You might encounter people across social strata, though facilities could be segregated by sex, and sometimes by time of day or specific areas. The atmosphere was informal, people were partially or fully unclothed, and interaction was common. You might strike up a conversation in the palestra, exercise area, share a chuckle in the tepidarium, warm room, or even exchange a suggestive look across the frigidarium, cold plunge pool. Historians still argue whether the level of casual nudity and mixing in Roman baths led to more overt flirting and sexual encounters than in other public spaces, or if strict social hierarchies and customs still maintain significant barriers. It's hard to get a definitive answer, as bathhouse gossip wasn't typically recorded for posterity. Temples and religious ceremonies also provided opportunities. While the primary purpose was religious observance, these gatherings brought people together. A shared moment of devotion, a glimpse during a procession, or even a conversation in the temple courtyard after the rituals concluded could be starting points. Sometimes religious festivals incorporated elements of myth or worship that were explicitly tied to love, fertility, or attraction, subtly sanctioning a focus on these themes during the event. Imagine flirting under the approving gaze of Venus or Aphrodite or Ishtar. It added a certain divine legitimacy to your quest. Beyond structured events, daily interactions in public spaces were key. Drawing water at a well, selling goods in the market, attending a public performance in a theater or amphitheater, these were opportunities to see and be seen. Clothing and personal adornment played a huge role here. While bathing habits might have been infrequent by our standards, people still cared about appearance, within the constraints of their resources. Simple clean linen, or as clean as you could get it, perhaps a piece of modest jewelry, hairstyled in a certain way, these were signals. A flash of a particularly vibrant dye, a carefully draped toga or stola, even just carrying yourself with confidence. These were public presentations designed, in part, to attract attention and signal availability or desirability. In many societies, women's public movements were restricted, and they might be veiled or accompanied by chaperones. This certainly complicated things. Flirting often had to be incredibly subtle, perhaps involving eye contact, brief smiles, or communication through gestures or through their companions. For men, the challenge might be to signal interest respectfully without being perceived as overly aggressive or dishonoring the woman or her family. It required navigating a delicate social tightrope, often with onlookers present. The concept of a chaperone is itself a fascinating element of public interaction. Having a family member, a servant, or an older relative present meant that direct, private conversation was often impossible in public. Flirting had to happen around the chaperone. This might involve directing comments towards the chaperone that were meant for the other person, using inside jokes they wouldn't understand, though this risked annoying the chaperone, or relying even more heavily on nonverbal cues when the chaperone was distracted. It was like playing a game of social chess, but with a very judgmental rulebook held by the person sitting right next to the queen. Mainstream historical fact: in ancient Greece, the agora, public square, was a central hub not just for political and commercial life, but also for social interaction. Men would gather there to discuss philosophy, politics, and everyday matters. And while respectable women's movements were often limited, encounters could still occur there or in adjacent areas like public fountains. Quirky tidbit: in some periods of Roman history, specialized signs or gestures might have been used in public to signal romantic interest or availability, sometimes quite subtly, to avoid the notice of chaperones or unwanted observers. These could range from the way a veil was held, to the arrangement of fingers, or even carrying specific objects. Think of it as an ancient, extremely low-tech version of swiping right, but you had to learn a secret handshake first. The sounds of public life were also integral to the experience. The hubbub of voices, the cries of vendors, the bleating of animals, the clanking of tools, the distant sound of music or chanting. These created a constant sensory environment. Flirting conversations had to compete with this noise, or perhaps use it as cover. A quiet word shared in a noisy crowd felt more intimate by contrast. Or perhaps the very act of being heard above the din was a way to command attention. Beyond intentional interaction, simply being in public allowed for observation. You could watch how someone moved, how they interacted with others, gauge their social standing based on their companions or clothing, see their expressions when they weren't directly addressing you. This passive observation was a crucial part of assessing compatibility and developing interest before any direct flirting even began. It was ancient world stalking, but totally socially acceptable and in fact unavoidable. Everyone was observing everyone else all the time. The transition from private communication via letters and tokens to public interaction was not always sequential. They often happened in parallel. You might exchange letters to arrange a meeting in public, or a public encounter might inspire the sending of a letter. The public arena was where potential connections were initially spotted, where reputations were on display, and where the initial, often subtle signals were exchanged before moving to more private or formal methods. Think about the effort involved in presenting yourself in public. While elaborate daily bathing wasn't a thing, people still spent time on grooming, styling hair, applying simple cosmetics, often plant-based pigments or mineral powders, perhaps using oils or perfumes to mask less pleasant smells, both their own and the environment's. Dressing in your best was a signal of respect and, implicitly, a desire to make a good impression. Showing up to a festival looking like you just wrestled a goat, unless that was part of the festival, I suppose, wasn't likely to get you many admiring glances. Public spaces also facilitated interaction with social networks. Flirting often involved not just the two individuals, but their friends and family. A friend might act as a go-between, subtly facilitating conversation or providing information. Family presence could either hinder or help, depending on whether they approved. Sometimes flirting in public was also about demonstrating your social skills and desirability to your own group, enhancing your standing. The rules of public interaction varied enormously across cultures and time periods. What was acceptable in one Roman era might be scandalous in another, or completely forbidden in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The presence of enslaved people, who were often part of wealthy households and public life, added another layer of complexity to social interactions and potential power dynamics within flirting. A person's status, freeborn, freed, enslaved, citizen, non-citizen, profoundly affected where they could go, who they could interact with, and how openly they could express interest. Flirting between different social classes, while perhaps happening furtively, carried significant risks. Overall, navigating the public realm was a vital skill for anyone hoping to find a partner or engage in romantic pursuits. It required awareness, discretion, and the ability to seize fleeting opportunities while adhering to strict social rules. It was a constant balancing act between signaling interest and maintaining respectability in the eyes of the community. And while letters and tokens allowed for carefully constructed messages, public spaces offered the chance for spontaneous chemistry, for the electricity of a shared glance or a brief, almost accidental touch in a crowded street. It was messy, it was noisy, it was often smelly, but it was where life happened and where the ancient dance of attraction played out for all, or at least many, to see. So you've navigated the choppy, smelly waters of public spaces, perhaps catching a glimpse, exchanging a smile, maybe even managing a shared laugh that wasn't just you nervously choking on dust. You've perhaps progressed beyond just observing or sending discreet signals. Now comes a more concrete, albeit still often subtle, stage in the ancient dance of attraction, the exchange of gifts and tokens. Think about it. In a world without instant messaging, without dating apps, without even reliable postal services for everyone, how do you show sustained interest? How do you elevate a connection beyond fleeting glances or whispered words? Gifts, tangible objects that represent thought, effort, resources, and intent. These weren't necessarily grand gestures like presenting someone with a chariot or a small, strategically located island, though I'm sure that happened if you were wealthy enough. More often, they were small, personal, and symbolic. What kind of things did people give? It varied wildly depending on the culture, the social status of the giver and receiver, and the stage of the burgeoning relationship. Sometimes it was something handmade, a small carved wooden figure, a piece of simple pottery you shaped yourself, hopefully better than that lopsided one you were trying to sell at the market, a woven bracelet, an embroidered cloth. A handmade gift spoke of time and personal effort invested, which in a world where survival often took up most of your time, was a significant offering. It wasn't just an object, it was hours of your life shaped into something for them. That's a powerful message, even if the carving looked a bit like a potato with delusions of grandeur. Other times, gifts might be natural objects with symbolic meaning. Flowers or garlands were common, representing beauty, fertility, or specific emotions depending on the type. Certain plants or herbs might carry connotations related to love, fidelity, or passion. Giving someone a sprig of myrtle associated with Aphrodite was perhaps the ancient world's equivalent of a slightly aggressive yet romantic Spotify playlist title. Fruits, especially pomegranates or apples, could also have symbolic weight related to fertility and desire. Offering a perfectly ripe apple wasn't just about sustenance. It could be a callback to myths and stories where these fruits played a role in temptation or love. Small, personal items were also exchanged. A piece of jewelry, maybe a simple bead, a shell pendant, or a small bronze ring if you had some means. A comb or a pin for the hair, a small amount of precious oil or perfumed unguent. These were things that touched the body, were worn close, and served as a constant reminder of the giver. Imagine wearing a simple ring given by someone you admired. Every time you looked at your hand, there it was, a tiny, silent message across the miles or the marketplace. Tokens could also be less about inherent value and more about shared experience or inside jokes. A smooth, interesting stone found together, a feather, a particularly shiny piece of pottery shard from a shared location. These objects, seemingly insignificant to others, held deep meaning for the two people involved. They were physical anchors for memories, little secrets shared in plain sight. Remember that time we almost fell into the Tiber trying to fish out that lost sandal? Here's a slightly waterlogged pebble from the bank. Romance. The act of giving itself was crucial. It wasn't always a direct handoff. Sometimes the gift might be left in a place where the intended recipient would find it, tied to their door, left near their usual spot at the well, tucked into their market stall when they weren't looking. This required knowledge of their routine and a degree of stealth, adding an element of playful intrigue. Imagine the thrill of finding a small, unexpected token left just for you. It felt clandestine, personal, like a tiny conspiracy woven just for two people in a crowded world. Who initiated the gift giving? Historically, it was often expected that the man would initiate courtship and offer gifts to the woman. However, this wasn't universal, and women certainly found ways to signal interest and reciprocate affection, sometimes through gifts given via intermediaries or in contexts where it was socially permissible. A woman might weave a special garment for a man she admired, or offer him food she had prepared. These acts, while potentially framed as general kindness or familial duty, could carry unspoken romantic significance. The value of the gift often reflected social status and economic means. A wealthy individual might offer something truly precious, a piece of imported silk, a finely crafted piece of gold jewelry, or even livestock. For most people, however, gifts were humble. The effort and symbolism were often more important than the monetary value. A simple, carefully chosen flower could mean more than a carelessly offered, expensive trinket. Though I suppose getting an island wasn't usually met with disappointment. Gift giving could also be a way to test the waters. Offering a small gift was a less direct declaration than outright stating your feelings. If the gift was accepted, it was a positive sign, indicating potential interest or at least openness to further interaction. If it was refused, or if the recipient seemed uncomfortable or returned it, that was a clear, albeit often painful, signal of disinterest. It allowed for a subtle probing of the other person's feelings without a potentially embarrassing verbal rejection in public. It was like sending a low-stakes probe drone before launching the main invasion. The timing of the gift was also important. Too early, and it might seem presumptuous or even suspicious. Too late, and the moment might have passed. A gift might be given after a particularly pleasant public encounter, after a shared conversation, or leading up to an anticipated meeting. It punctuated the growing connection, marking milestones in the unspoken courtship. Gifts weren't always explicitly romantic either. Sometimes they were framed as tokens of friendship, respect, or gratitude, allowing for plausible deniability if the romantic interest wasn't reciprocated or was socially inappropriate. You could offer someone a small gift as thanks for their help or as a sign of good neighborliness, while hoping it would be understood on a deeper level. This deniability was crucial in societies with strict social rules around interaction between unmarried individuals. Historians still argue whether the exchange of small, personal tokens became more formalized in certain periods or remained largely an informal, spontaneous aspect of courtship. Evidence comes from literature, art, and sometimes grave goods, but pinning down the exact social customs across different regions and time periods is tricky. We have hints, but no universal rulebook of ancient flirtation gift etiquette. Think about the practicalities. You've made this small gift, maybe a carved bone comb. How do you get it to the person? You could try leaving it, as mentioned, or you might need to rely on an intermediary, a trusted friend, a sympathetic relative, if they were in on it and approved, or even a household servant who could discreetly pass it along. Using an intermediary added another layer of complexity and risk, as their loyalty and discretion were paramount. You didn't want your carefully crafted romantic overture ending up as a chew toy for the recipient's dog because the messenger got distracted. These tokens served multiple purposes. They were declarations of interest, ways to gauge reciprocity, conversation starters or continuations, and physical reminders. In a world where people might not see each other every day, and where written communication wasn't universally accessible or appropriate, a physical object held significant power. It was proof, a tangible link between two people navigating the tricky path towards connection. Consider the potential meaning embedded in different types of gifts. A gift related to personal grooming, a comb, oil, suggested an appreciation for the recipient's person and perhaps an encouragement of their self-care, which, let's face it, might have been appreciated. A gift of food or drink could symbolize sustenance, care, and sharing, fundamental acts of intimacy. A gift of something beautiful, like a flower or jewelry, was a direct compliment to their appearance or spirit. Giving someone a smooth, pretty stone might simply say, "I noticed this and I thought of you," which is a timeless and lovely sentiment. Quirky tidbit. In some ancient Roman love poetry, there are mentions of lovers exchanging small, symbolic objects like writing tablets, perhaps with messages already written or for future communication, rings, or even pieces of clothing. The act of simply touching an object that the beloved had previously touched could also hold significance. The emotional weight attached to these objects was immense. Receiving a gift from someone you were interested in must have caused a flutter of excitement, a careful examination of the object for hidden meanings, and anxious deliberation over how to respond. Did you keep it, display it, hide it? Did you give something back? What did that reciprocal gift signify? It was a silent dialogue conducted through objects. The absence of a gift or the giving of an inappropriate gift could also send a message. Not receiving an expected token after weeks of hopeful glances might signal a lack of interest. Receiving a gift that was clearly too expensive or too humble might communicate something unintended about the giver's perception of the relationship or the recipient's worth. Social rules dictated much of this, and missteps could be embarrassing or even damaging. Imagine the skill required to choose the right gift. It had to be appropriate for your means, appropriate for the recipient's status, and convey the right level of interest without being overly bold or too timid. It was a delicate calculation, a bit like trying to guess someone's favorite obscure band based on their shoe color. These exchanges weren't just for the initial stages of courtship. Gifts continued throughout a relationship, solidifying bonds and marking anniversaries, though the concept of a formal anniversary gift might be a modern one. But the first tokens, those initial probes of interest exchanged before formal agreements or public declarations, held a special place. They were the physical manifestations of hope and burgeoning affection in a world where showing such feelings openly was often constrained. Even seemingly simple objects could carry layers of meaning. A small, well-made pottery oil lamp might seem practical, but it also provides light, perhaps symbolizing bringing light into someone's life, or allowing for clandestine nighttime meetings. Though PG-13 reminder, we're talking about potential meetings, not necessarily what happened at them. The interpretation was key and often subjective, leaving plenty of room for hopeful misinterpretations or frustrating ambiguity. It's a bit like trying to figure out if someone's emoji usage is friendly or flirting, ancient version, but with more clay. The continuity of this practice across cultures and millennia is striking. Giving gifts as a way to show affection and interest is a fundamental human behavior. While the specific objects in the social context have changed dramatically, the underlying principle remains the same: using a tangible item to communicate something intangible, your feelings for another person. In an era before soap dominated personal hygiene, these carefully chosen tokens were a way to focus attention away from potential less than fresh aromas and towards something beautiful, thoughtful, or symbolic. They were little bright spots, physical anchors of connection in a sometimes difficult and uncertain world. They allowed for a personal, often private dialogue woven into the fabric of daily life, a silent language of hope spoken through objects touched by two people hoping to bridge the distance between them. You ventured into the delicate territory of tangible tokens, perhaps sending or receiving a small object that carries unspoken meaning, a little physical anchor to a connection you hope is growing. Maybe that carved comb or that sprig of myrtle was accepted with a smile, a blush, or a carefully neutral expression that you desperately hoped hid enthusiasm. Now the dance must evolve. Glances across a crowded marketplace are thrilling, shared laughter at the well is promising, and the exchange of gifts is a significant step, but they don't build a relationship alone. At some point, if both parties are interested and circumstances allow, you need more. You need closer proximity, dedicated time, conversation beyond shouted greetings over livestock noise. You need, well, something like a date, but dating as we know it didn't really exist. You couldn't just casually ask someone to meet you for a coffee. Coffee wasn't a thing. Or a movie, neither were movies. Or even a quiet dinner alone, socially unlikely, especially for unmarried women. Social structures, family oversight, and the realities of daily life made spontaneous, one-on-one outings between unmarried individuals incredibly difficult, often impossible or scandalous. So how did you engineer opportunities for closer interaction? How did you move from hopeful observation and symbolic exchange to actual spending time together? It required strategy, discretion, and sometimes a bit of luck. One common method, particularly for those with some means or in cultures with specific social gathering points, was to arrange to be in the same place at the same time, but in a setting where interaction was permissible, if still often supervised. This might be a religious festival, a public performance, a trip to the baths, segregated obviously, let's not get ahead of ourselves, or visiting a mutual acquaintance's home. You weren't explicitly meeting each other, you were just both happening to be at the annual harvest celebration or the performance of that new playwright everyone was talking about. Within these sanctioned public spaces, you could then attempt to create micro-opportunities for interaction. Maybe you lingered near the recipient of your affections, hoping for a chance to exchange a few more words than usual. Perhaps you positioned yourself so you could observe them more closely, catching their eye across the crowd, maybe even sharing a quiet smile that went deeper than the polite ones exchanged in passing. It was about turning a public event into a semi-private moment. It required patience and the ability to seize brief openings. Like trying to find a moment to whisper a compliment, saw you without your Aunt Bertha, who happens to be standing right there hearing you. Awkward. Another approach involved intermediaries, much like with gift giving. You might rely on a trusted friend, a sympathetic servant, or even a relative, if they approved of the match, to facilitate meetings. This could involve passing messages to suggest being at a certain place at a certain time, or even arranging supervised visits. A female friend might invite the object of her friend's affection to a gathering at her home where her friend would also be present, under the watchful eye of her family. A male friend might steer a conversation towards a planned outing, say, hunting or visiting a specific part of the city, hoping the admired woman's male relatives might also attend, thus allowing for indirect interaction. These intermediaries were crucial, acting as social go-betweens who could navigate the complex rules of interaction. They could gauge interest, relay intentions, and create opportunities without the main parties risking direct, potentially inappropriate communication. Think of them as the original dating app algorithms, but with fewer bugs and slightly less confusing profile pictures. For the wealthy and well-connected, social calls were a way to spend time together, albeit usually under strict supervision. A man might visit a woman's home, but he would be received in a public area of the house, with family members or servants always present. Conversation would be polite, formal, and likely focused on approved topics. These weren't exactly heart-to-heart chats, but they allowed for observation, subtle cues, and demonstrating one's wit and social graces, or lack thereof. It was like a job interview, but for a potential lifelong commitment and with more toga adjustments. Secret meetings, while romanticized in literature and certainly happening, were fraught with danger and social ruin if discovered. They required incredible secrecy and trust. Finding a private place was hard in densely populated ancient cities. Maybe an out-of-the-way temple precinct after hours, a quiet corner of a garden, or a secluded spot by a river outside the city walls. These meetings were likely brief and focused on stolen moments of conversation or physical closeness, not exactly dinner and a show. The risk involved added a layer of intensity, but the potential cost, reputational damage, forced marriage, or even violence was significant. This wasn't the kind of casual Netflix and chill you might be used to. It was more like risk everything and maybe talk for 5 minutes by the smelly docks. Mainstream historical fact: in ancient Rome, while social interaction between men and women was more fluid in public spaces than in some other cultures, formal courtship often involved the man visiting the woman's home, usually with family members present, as part of the process leading towards betrothal. Public events were also key places for initial encounters and observations. The practicalities of arranging these encounters were immense. How did you send a message? Relying on trustworthy people was key. Written messages were possible for the literate, but carrying them could be risky and they could be intercepted. Verbal messages delivered by a friend or servant required absolute accuracy and discretion. Imagine trying to coordinate a meeting point and time just by whispering instructions to a busy, potentially forgetful friend. Meet me by the third olive cart from the forum entrance. No, the other forum entrance at sunset, unless it's cloudy, then meet me by the large cracked amphora. No, that was last week. Let's just stick to the olive cart, okay? Logistical nightmares were probably common. Historians still argue whether the extent of secret, unsupervised meetings was widespread among common people or largely confined to the realm of romantic literature and the very brave or foolish elite. Evidence is scarce and often anecdotal, leaving us to wonder just how many clandestine whispers were exchanged under the moonlight. Finding a genuinely private spot could also be challenging due to the constant presence of others, family, neighbors, servants, just the general bustling crowds. Even a seemingly quiet corner might have someone within earshot, making intimate conversation difficult. And let's not forget the pervasive ancient world scentscape. Trying to have a romantic moment while dodging puddles and ignoring the nearby animal smells required serious focus. You'd need to really like someone to overlook that. Darling, your eyes are like the stars. Pity about that persistent goat smell, isn't it? Okay, maybe not. Quirky tidbit. In some Greek cities, it was customary for men to exercise naked in the gymnasia. While primarily male spaces, attractive youths might attract the attention of older men, and courtship could occur within this context, often involving gifts and poems. This is a reminder that flirting looked very different depending on the culture and social structure. The stakes were high. A successful meeting could deepen the connection, confirm mutual interest, and pave the way for further steps towards a formal proposal or commitment. A failed attempt, a misunderstanding, or worse, discovery, could lead to embarrassment, punishment, or a permanent end to any possibility of a relationship. The pressure to get it right must have been immense. It wasn't just about impressing the other person, it was about navigating an entire social minefield. Even within permissible contexts like festivals or visits, communication was often subtle. You might use body language, prolonged eye contact, remembering those intense gazes, or careful phrasing to convey deeper meaning beneath a veneer of polite conversation. The ability to read these subtle cues was essential. Did that comment about the weather really just mean they thought it was hot? Or was it a veiled invitation to meet somewhere cooler? The ambiguity was probably both frustrating and exciting. This stage of courtship was about finding or creating pockets of shared time amidst the demands and constraints of ancient life. It was a transition from the hopeful distance of observation and the symbolism of gifts to the slightly more direct, but still carefully controlled realm of personal interaction. It required courage to seek out these opportunities, ingenuity to arrange them, and a careful understanding of the social rules to avoid disaster. It was a delicate dance, choreographed by custom, necessity, and that persistent, powerful desire for connection, even in a world that smelled less than ideal. So you've navigated the tricky waters of hopeful glances, perhaps exchanged small tokens, and even managed to engineer a few precious, often supervised, moments of closer proximity. You've seen them across the crowded market, maybe shared a quick, meaningful glance during a festival, or perhaps even had a polite, chaperone-adjacent conversation in a shared social setting. This is good. Progress, as they say, is progress. You've moved beyond mere observation to tentative interaction. But what happens next? How do you take this fragile connection, built on subtle cues and stolen moments, and turn it into something more solid, something that society recognizes and sanctions? Because here's the thing, in most societies before the widespread concept of individual choice in marriage, getting together wasn't just about two people deciding they liked each other a lot. It was a family affair, an economic arrangement, a social contract that extended far beyond your personal feelings, however intense they might be. You didn't just start going steady. You entered into a complex process involving negotiations, agreements, and often a significant transfer of wealth or property. Think of it less like swiping right and more like a merger between two corporations, where you and the object of your affection are merely key assets being discussed by the CEOs, your parents or guardians. Their reputations, their social standing, their economic stability, all of these were on the line, and yours by extension. A good match could elevate a family's status, a bad one could bring ruin or shame. The pressure to choose wisely, or rather, for your family to choose wisely for you, was immense. The first formal step after a period of courtship, however brief or long it might have been, was often betrothal. This wasn't the wedding itself, but a solemn promise to marry in the future. It was often as legally binding, if not more so, than the actual marriage ceremony in many historical cultures. Breaking a betrothal could carry significant penalties, from fines to social ostracism. So while your heart might have fluttered during those shared glances, the transition to betrothal was a decidedly serious, practical matter. This is where the negotiations began. Typically, the male heads of the two families would meet, often with legal advisors or respected community elders present. They would discuss the terms of the union, and by terms we mean property, money, and expectations. This is where the concept of the dowry or bride price comes in. A dowry was usually property or money brought by the bride's family to the groom or his family, intended to support the bride in her new household and sometimes to contribute to the family's overall wealth. A bride price was the opposite, payment from the groom or his family to the bride's family in exchange for her. These were not token amounts. They could be vast sums of money, land, livestock, slaves, or valuable goods. The size of the dowry or bride price was a reflection of the family's wealth and status and a crucial point of negotiation. Arguments over how much was sufficient, what assets were included, and how they would be managed were common. Imagine your love life being contingent on whether your dad can haggle successfully over the number of goats involved. Not exactly romantic, is it? So you're saying 50 silver coins and 3 prime milk cows? My daughter is worth at least 60 coins in a vineyard. These were real conversations, happening while you likely waited nervously in another room, praying they wouldn't mess it up because Uncle Throckmorton was being stubborn about the inheritance split. Mainstream historical fact: in ancient Rome, betrothal, sponsalia, was a formal agreement between the families of the prospective bride and groom, often marked by a ring, annulus pronubis, given by the groom to the bride, and was legally binding before the actual marriage ceremony, nuptiae. The betrothal contract itself would often specify not just the financial arrangements, but also details about the wedding date, living arrangements, and what would happen in case of divorce or death. It was essentially a prenuptial agreement, written on papyrus or parchment, hammered out by people who were probably less concerned with your emotional compatibility and more concerned with property lines and inheritance laws. Intermediaries, like those used for facilitating meetings, often played a role here too. They might act as go-betweens for the families during the negotiation phase, softening potential disagreements or ensuring smooth communication. They needed to be skilled diplomats, capable of navigating fragile egos and entrenched financial positions. It was like high-stakes arbitration, but the prize was a lifetime commitment, yours. What about your feelings in all of this? Well, that depended heavily on the culture and the specific families involved. In some societies, particularly for the elite, your personal preference might carry some weight, but it was usually secondary to dynastic alliances or economic advantage. In others, particularly lower classes where survival might depend on mutual effort, there might be more room for personal connection, but family approval and practical considerations like whether you could both actually survive together were still paramount. Historians still argue whether genuine affection was a common factor in arranged marriages, or if it was something that might maybe develop after the wedding if you were lucky. Quirky tidbit. In some early medieval Germanic societies, the marriage contract wasn't just about property. It could also include clauses detailing how often the husband was expected to provide certain gifts to his wife, or what rights she retained over her own property after marriage. Think of it as early marital benefits laid out legally. The transition from courtship to betrothal could also involve formal introductions between the families, feasts, and public announcements. It was a way for the families to signal their intentions to the community and solidify their agreement. These events, while perhaps stressful with all eyes on you and your potential in-laws, did offer more opportunities for the betrothed couple to interact, albeit still likely under supervision. You might sit together at a feast, share a toast, or participate in a joint ritual. It was a chance to get slightly more comfortable with the person you were now legally promised to before the final irreversible step of marriage. Imagine the awkwardness of these situations. You've spent weeks exchanging longing looks and maybe whispered a few words under a moonlit sky, and now you're sitting next to them at a formal dinner, trying to make polite conversation while your father argues with their uncle about livestock prices across the table. The tension must have been palpable. Did you try to gauge their feelings through small talk? Did you wonder if they were as overwhelmed by the process as you were? It was a crash course in combining the personal with the profoundly political and economic. Breaking a betrothal, as mentioned, was difficult. It required a valid reason. Sometimes infidelity, sometimes a serious illness, or perhaps a discovered impediment to the marriage. It wasn't something you did lightly just because you decided you didn't like their taste in tunic colors or their weird habit of chewing loudly. You were committed, legally and socially. So while your tentative steps in seeking out connection might have felt like the culmination of your efforts, they were often just the prelude to a whole new level of complexity, the formal negotiation and agreement between families that would determine your future. It was a world away from modern romance, where the biggest negotiation might be who picks the movie. This was about legacies, property, and ensuring the continued survival and prosperity of the family line. It required patience, a strong stomach for bureaucracy, and perhaps a dash of hope that the person on the other side of the betrothal agreement wasn't too unbearable. Because once that contract was signed, you were essentially locked in, waiting for the day the marriage ceremony would seal the deal. For better or potentially for a very long time worse. You've made it through the tense negotiations, the back and forth over livestock and land, the awkward formal introductions with families who now hold your entire future in their hands. The betrothal contract, a dry legal document that seals your fate far more effectively than any romantic vow ever could, is signed. Now comes the public declaration, the transition from being merely promised to officially united. The wedding day arrives not just a celebration, but a crucial social and legal event that solidifies the alliance between two families and announces your new status to the entire community. This wasn't typically a private affair. Weddings were inherently public performances. You weren't just getting married, you were putting on a show for everyone you knew. and probably a lot of people you didn't, affirming the legitimacy of the union and the standing of the families involved. Think of it as the ultimate social media post of its time, but instead of likes, you got witnesses and legal recognition. The rituals varied immensely depending on the culture, time period, and social class. In ancient Rome, a traditional wedding, a conferatio, was a solemn religious rite involving specific offerings to Jupiter, a priest, 10 witnesses, and the symbolic sharing of a spelt cake, phoreos panis. It was deeply rooted in religious and civic duty. Your father would likely formally transfer you from his authority, patria potestas, to your husband's. No white dresses yet, probably just your finest tunic and a hopeful, slightly terrified expression. For many cultures, the core element wasn't just a religious blessing, but the public consent and witness of the community. Simply living together or declaring yourselves married before witnesses was enough to constitute a legal marriage in many places for long stretches of history, far predating formal church ceremonies for everyone. This public aspect was key. It ensured everyone knew you were now off the market, bound by a new set of rules and expectations. Imagine trying to get away with eloping. Your families would probably track you down and drag you back for the proper public display. The transfer of the dowry or bride price, so painstakingly negotiated during the betrothal, was often a central part of the wedding proceedings or occurred immediately before or after. This wasn't just passing a few coins. It could be a literal parade of goods, livestock, or the signing over of property deeds. Witnessing this transfer further cemented the economic reality of the marriage. The bride's family delivered on their promise, and the groom's family acknowledged receiving what was agreed upon. It was like the closing ceremony on that merger agreement, but with cows. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval European traditions, the wedding ceremony might take place at the church door, in facie ecclesiae, rather than inside, with the priest acting as a witness to the couple's exchange of vows and the husband's endowment of his wife with property, the dower, before the mass inside followed. This highlighted the contractual nature happening outside the sacred space initially. Feasting and celebration were, of course, a major part of many historical weddings. A successful negotiation and public affirmation called for merriment. These could last for days, involving elaborate meals, music, dancing, and various forms of entertainment. This wasn't just about having fun, it was another form of public display, demonstrating the wealth and generosity of the host families and celebrating the new alliance. You'd likely be paraded around, toasted, and maybe even subjected to traditional and sometimes frankly embarrassing fertility rituals or jokes. Trying to maintain a dignified composure while Uncle Bertram tells a questionable story about his own wedding night must have been a challenge. Your role in the ceremony itself might have been largely passive, particularly for the bride. You were often presented, given away, and received. While some cultures involved mutual vows, the emphasis was often on the legal transfer of status and property and the creation of a new household unit recognized by the community. The vows might be simple declarations of intent or acceptance, witnessed by elders or religious figures. Historians still argue whether the concept of romantic love and personal choice had any significant impact on the structure of wedding ceremonies before the late medieval period, or if they remained primarily socio-economic and legal acts. Mainstream historical fact: in many Germanic and Scandinavian cultures during the Viking Age, marriage was primarily a civil contract agreed upon by the families, involving the exchange of pledges and property, like the munder, a payment from the groom to the bride's guardian, with religious elements often added later or being less central than the legal agreement. The consummation of the marriage was also historically significant, often considered the final step in solidifying the union, both legally and physically. In some traditions, there were even rituals or witnesses associated with the wedding night, ensuring that the marriage was indeed finalized. Talk about pressure. Imagine having your marriage validated by, well, a committee. It added yet another layer of public expectation and scrutiny to a deeply personal moment. So after all the subtle signals, the chance encounters, the nerve-wracking negotiations, and the formal betrothal, the wedding ceremony was the grand finale. the public declaration that you and your new spouse were now a unit. It wasn't necessarily the culmination of a personal love story as we might think of it today, but the successful execution of a complex social and economic agreement, witnessed and validated by the community. It marked your transition into a new phase of life, with new responsibilities, allegiances, and perhaps, if you were very lucky, a life partner you could actually stand to be around. And as you stood there, perhaps slightly overwhelmed by the weight of tradition and expectation, you knew that this was the beginning of everything, the blending of families, the potential for children, and navigating the complexities of life together, armed with little more than a legal contract and a shared public commitment. So you've got your oils, your scraping tools, maybe some powders or fragrant plants at your disposal. You've got the basic toolkit for managing the less than fresh realities of life before widespread soap. But having the tools wasn't the same as being able to use them effectively or often. And this brings us right back to the messy, complicated, and frankly often unfair world of social stratification. Because in this pre-soap era, how clean you managed to be, or at least appear, was deeply intertwined with your social status and access to resources. It wasn't just about personal preference. It was a clear signal to potential mates about where you stood in the pecking order. Think about it. Water wasn't always easy to come by. Carrying it could be backbreaking work. Heating it required fuel, which cost money or labor to gather. Oils like olive oil, while used for cleaning, were also food, lamp fuel, and valuable commodities. High-quality perfumes or imported resins were luxury goods, equivalent to designer fragrances today. Even simple tools like bronze or silver strigils cost money. If you were poor, living a hand-to-mouth existence, were you really going to spend your precious time, energy, and minimal income on elaborate bathing rituals or expensive unguents? Probably not. Your priority was survival, finding food, shelter, and avoiding plague, not smelling like a rose garden that had been strategically placed downwind of a farm. The wealthy, on the other hand, had slaves or servants to fetch water, heat it, assist with bathing, and apply oils and perfumes. They lived in homes with better access to water, sometimes even private bathing facilities, or could afford frequent trips to public baths without worrying about the payment or time commitment. They had the means to acquire fine oils, imported spices for perfumes, and elegant tools. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this. In Roman society, while public baths were open to citizens of varying classes, though sometimes with differentiated access or fees, the frequency and completeness of bathing rituals, especially the use of oils and perfumes, varied significantly with wealth. A senator might bathe daily and employ expensive Syrian perfumes, while a plebeian laborer might bathe less often and use cheaper, locally sourced materials, if any at all. This created a very real and perhaps very noticeable difference in how people presented themselves. Someone who consistently smelled pleasant, or at least less unpleasant, than others, whose skin looked smoother and less dry from regular oiling and scraping, and whose hair was perhaps treated with fragrant oils rather than simply being greasy from accumulated dirt, was essentially wearing their wealth on their sleeve and on their skin. It was a visual and olfactory declaration. I have resources. I have leisure time. I have access to the good stuff. When you were navigating the complex dance of ancient flirting, these signals were powerful. A potential partner wasn't just assessing your looks, your humor, or your personality. They were assessing your ability to maintain a certain level of personal presentation, because that presentation was a proxy for your potential as a provider or a valuable match. Someone who smelled clean, even by the lower standards of the time, and perhaps wore a subtle or not so subtle perfume was demonstrating their ability to invest in themselves, a trait that likely correlated strongly with their overall status and access to wealth. Marrying someone who could afford to smell nice was probably a step up. Imagine the ancient equivalent of swiping right on someone who looks like they showered recently and smells faintly of, well, something not terrible. Swoon. The opposite was also true. Someone who couldn't afford basic cleansing materials or didn't have the time or access to water would likely have a more pronounced natural scent of sweat, body odor, accumulated grime, and perhaps skin that was rougher or more irritated. This wasn't necessarily seen as a moral failing. Life was hard, but it was an undeniable indicator of a lower social standing. And while love knows no bounds and certainly isn't limited by hygiene levels, societal pressures and practical considerations meant that status played a huge role in mate selection. Flirting across significant class lines would have been even more challenging when one party literally smelled like they'd been working in the fields all day without a proper wash, while the other smelled like a walking spice market. Public spaces, like those bustling Roman baths we mentioned, offered a glimpse into these differences. While they were theoretically open to many, the experience within them differed. The elite might have their own private rooms or preferred times, and they certainly brought their own high-quality oils and perfumes, maybe even attended by their slaves. The less privileged might share communal oil areas, use cheaper, perhaps rancid oils if any, and their presence was governed by the realities of their demanding lives. Observing who could afford the better treatments, who lingered longer in the warm rooms, and who emerged smelling of expensive resins versus cheaper, greasier scents was all part of the social observation that fed into matchmaking and romantic interest. Historians still argue whether the conscious intent behind ancient hygiene practices was primarily about attracting mates, or if the attractive side effects, smelling better, looking smoother, were simply beneficial outcomes of practices primarily driven by other factors like religious purity, social ritual, or comfort. It's likely a blend, but the outcome was undeniable. Looking and smelling better was easier for the wealthy, and this advantage translated into their desirability in the marriage market. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is how specific, rare ingredients in perfumes became signals of truly elite status. Using a perfume derived from ingredients only available through distant trade routes, like frankincense from Arabia or cinnamon from India, was not just about smelling good. It was about demonstrating your network, your wealth, and your access to the most exotic resources the world offered. Imagine the ancient equivalent of saying, "Oh, this little scent, it's flown in fresh this morning on my private trade ship." That was the kind of signal that got attention. This investment in personal grooming wasn't just about masking odor, it was also about enhancing appearance. Smooth, oiled skin was seen as desirable, a sign of health and perhaps indoor leisure rather than outdoor manual labor. White teeth achieved with abrasive powders were valued. Even hair treatments using oils or sometimes more complex mixtures contributed to a groomed appearance that was more attainable for those with time and resources. Comparing ancient grooming efforts to scrolling through modern dating profiles, it's like the difference between a profile picture where someone clearly put effort into their appearance, good lighting, nice clothes, brushed hair, versus one that looks like a hastily taken selfie in poor light with visible laundry in the background. Both exist, but one is signaling a higher investment in presentation. So when someone from a lower social stratum attempted to flirt with someone of higher status, they were facing an uphill battle that went beyond personality differences. There was a tangible olfactory and visual barrier that spoke volumes about their respective places in society. While a charming personality or striking looks could certainly bridge gaps, the practical realities of daily life meant that maintaining a presentation considered desirable by the elite was a significant challenge for the poor. Historians still debate whether sumptuary laws, which sometimes regulated dress and appearance based on class, extended into controlling personal grooming practices beyond public displays. But the economic reality certainly created a de facto class system of cleanliness. The effort involved also spoke volumes. For the less privileged, any attempt at significant grooming, finding extra water, gathering fuel, saving up for a small amount of oil, represented a much larger sacrifice of time and resources than it did for the wealthy. Therefore, managing to present oneself even slightly better than the average person from one's own class was also a signal of ambition, diligence, or perhaps support from family. It showed you were putting in the work. An effort in any era can be attractive. It showed you cared enough to try and elevate yourself, even if only in appearance. This is perhaps where the more hopeful side of pre-soap flirting lies. that even within the constraints of class, individual effort in personal presentation could still make a difference. In conclusion, the link between hygiene, as it was understood then, and status in the ancient world was profound. It wasn't just about personal cleanliness. It was a powerful, often unavoidable, advertisement of one's place in society, one's access to resources, and therefore one's desirability as a mate. Navigating the romantic landscape involved decoding these signals, understanding that the ability to smell nice and look smooth was less about having great genes and more about having great wealth. And that fundamental reality shaped every flirtatious glance, every whispered word, and every carefully applied layer of fragrant oil in the fascinating, fragrant, and sometimes downright pungent world before soap made widespread cleanliness an everyday possibility. Okay, so you've mastered the art of strategic oil application and vigorous scraping, maybe dabbed on some precious unguent to distract from the inevitable. You've learned that smelling nice, or at least less bad, was a distinct advantage, especially if you could afford the good stuff. But looking appealing wasn't just about fragrance. It was also intensely focused on skin texture. And in many ancient cultures, that meant dealing with something you might not even think twice about today: body hair. Yes, body hair. You see, while modern sensibilities often vary wildly on this topic, in many corners of the ancient world, smooth, hairless skin was considered a mark of beauty, youth, cleanliness, and even high social status. If you were trying to catch someone's eye across a crowded marketplace or make a good impression at a symposium, the presence or absence of hair on certain parts of your body spoke volumes. It wasn't just about personal preference. It was about conforming to powerful cultural norms. Think about the lengths people would go to achieve this look. Your toolkit for grooming wasn't just oils and scrapers. It expanded to include instruments and substances dedicated solely to hair removal. You might have a pair of bronze tweezers, perhaps surprisingly similar to modern ones, but far less precise. Plucking was tedious, painful, and best suited for small areas or stray hairs. Imagine plucking your legs with ancient tweezers. You'd probably give up after approximately 3 hairs and just accept your fate. Then there were razors. Early razors were often made of bronze, copper, or later, iron. They were rudimentary affairs, certainly not the multi-blade wonders you might use today. Shaving with these could be tricky, difficult to get a close shave, easy to cut yourself, and the blades dulled quickly, requiring constant resharpening, which was a skill in itself. Trying to shave delicate areas with a blunt bronze blade? Let's just say treacherous is an understatement. Waxing was also a thing, although perhaps not in the form of heated strips you might recognize. Ancient methods involved sticky substances like resins, beeswax, or even pitch applied to the skin and then pulled off, taking the hair with it. Sounds familiar, right? And just as painful. You'd grit your teeth and hope for the best, probably needing a stiff drink afterwards. The pain, then as now, was considered part of the price of beauty, or, in this context, the price of presenting yourself as a desirable, well-groomed individual. Perhaps the most intriguing and often terrifying methods involve depilatory creams or pastes. These concoctions aim to dissolve the hair or weaken it so it could be rubbed off. The recipes varied wildly by region and era, but many involved ingredients that would make a modern chemist gasp. Common components included quicklime, calcium oxide, starch, oils, and animal fats. But some recipes veered into truly alarming territory, incorporating things like arsenic sulfide, orpiment or realgar, lead compounds, or even strange biological ingredients based on folklore, like bat blood or cat dung, the latter often used with superstitious intent, perhaps to prevent hair from growing back at all. A fringe tidbit that highlights the blend of practical effort and magical thinking. Using depilatories was a gamble. You might end up smooth, or you might end up with a nasty chemical burn. The ancient equivalent of reading terrifying online reviews before trying a new product. A mainstream historical fact underscoring the importance of this. In Roman society, both men and women routinely practiced hair removal from various parts of the body, including legs, arms, and even pubic areas. Public baths often had specific rooms or servants dedicated to hair removal, the ellipti or droppatista, using tweezers or depilatory pastes. Being smooth-skinned was so ingrained in Roman beauty standards that artists depicted ideal figures, male and female, with minimal body hair. The hairy barbarian was the contrast, the other, reinforcing the idea that smoothness was civilized and desirable. Why was this so important? Aesthetics certainly played a huge role. Smooth skin was associated with youth and an idealized form. There was also potentially a perceived hygiene benefit, as less hair might mean less trapped sweat and odor, though in the absence of soap, this was likely minimal. But perhaps most significantly, hair removal was a clear signal of status. It required time, effort, materials, and often, money or the labor of slaves. A person who could afford to be consistently smooth was someone who wasn't engaged in manual labor, where hair provided protection and was perhaps less of a concern, had leisure time for grooming, and could access the necessary tools or substances. When you were trying to attract a mate, your level of hairiness, or lack thereof, was another piece of information you presented. A potential partner observing your smooth limbs wasn't just seeing skin, they were seeing a sign of your life circumstances. Someone with coarse, ungroomed body hair might be assumed to be of lower status, working outdoors, and lacking the resources for proper grooming. Conversely, a person with meticulously plucked brows, smooth arms, and perhaps even a carefully depilated body was showcasing their position in society. It was, in a way, another form of conspicuous consumption, visible on your very skin. Historians still argue whether hair removal practices were driven primarily by aesthetic ideals borrowed from Greek sculpture and philosophy, or by practical considerations like hygiene or comfort, or if it was simply a self-perpetuating fashion trend amplified by the elite. It was likely a complex mix, varying by culture, time, and social stratum. But the practical outcome for someone navigating the ancient dating scene was clear. Looking smooth was generally about a plus. Imagine the subtle signals exchanged. A woman in ancient Rome might discreetly reveal a smooth arm. A man might show off hairless legs under his tunic. These weren't just casual displays. They were carefully curated presentations designed to meet cultural expectations of beauty and status. It was part of the same overall package as wearing fine clothes, using expensive perfumes, and maintaining a certain posture or demeanor. Everything contributed to the image you projected to potential partners. Of course, standards weren't monolithic. While Romans embraced hairlessness, attitudes varied elsewhere. Some cultures might have viewed abundant body hair as a sign of virility or strength in men, or maturity in women. But within the dominant urban cultures we often study, particularly those with extensive written records like Rome, the trend towards smooth skin was powerful and influenced romantic interactions. So while smelling nice with oils and perfumes helped mask the inevitable BO, presenting smooth skin, achieved through potentially painful and sometimes dangerous methods, was another crucial layer in ancient personal presentation. It required dedication, resources, and a high tolerance for discomfort. It was a visible indicator of your commitment to prevailing beauty standards and, more often than not, your place on the social ladder. And when you were trying to win someone over, every little bit helped, even if it meant enduring the ancient equivalent of a terrible waxing appointment. You were literally putting your skin in the game. So you've put in the work. You've scraped away the grime, slathered on the scented oils, endured the plucking or pasting, and maybe even risked a chemical burn in pursuit of smoothness. You smell, if not clean, then at least intriguingly fragrant. A walking advertisement for the perfumer's art and your own dedication to presentation. You've done everything you possibly could within the limits of pre-soap technology to present yourself as a desirable individual. Now comes the moment of truth, the actual act of trying to catch someone's attention, to make a connection in a world that smelled, well, like a world without soap. Think about the environments where this crucial interaction would unfold. It might be at the public baths, paradoxically a place of both communal washing of sorts and social interaction, where you might catch someone's eye across the steamy caldarium, or perhaps at a lively symposium in Greece or a dinner party in Rome, where wine flowed, conversation buzzed, and people were expected to be at their social and aesthetic best. The marketplace, the theater, religious festivals, all offered opportunities for encounters. In these settings, your carefully curated appearance wasn't just for show, it was your opening line, a nonverbal declaration of who you were and what you valued. Without the clean slate that regular soap and water provides, every visible effort mattered intensely. The sheen of oil on your skin, the artful arrangement of your hair, the lack of noticeable body odor, or the presence of a pleasant perfume masking it, these weren't minor details. They were foundational elements of your appeal. Someone looking at you was subconsciously or perhaps consciously assessing the effort you'd put in. It demonstrated discipline, resources, and an understanding of cultural norms. It showed you cared about how you were perceived. Actual flirting methods weren't entirely different from today, just perhaps more intense given the context. Eye contact was key. A direct gaze, held perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, could convey interest. Subtle smiles, gestures with hands or the tilt of the head. Offering a small gift, perhaps a fruit, a flower, or a trinket, was a common approach to signal interest without being overly bold. Poetry, music, and witty conversation were highly valued, especially in elite circles. A man might recite a poem he'd written for a woman. A woman might charm with her intelligence and grace. Your ability to engage intellectually and artistically was just as important as your physical presentation. But the physical presentation was often what got your foot in the door, so to speak. Consider the challenges. Trying to maintain an air of alluring mystery when everyone around you carries the distinct aroma of dried sweat, rancid oil, and communal body odor required significant personal investment. Imagine leaning in to whisper something sweet and getting an unexpected blast of someone's less than fresh breath. It certainly added an extra layer of complexity to courtship. You hoped your own expensive breath mints, if you could afford them, often made from herbs or resins, were doing their job. A mainstream historical fact that brings this to life. In ancient Rome, flirting often took place during elaborate dinner parties, convivia. Guests reclined on couches, ate rich food, often with their hands, drank copious amounts of wine, listened to music, watched dancers, and engaged in conversation and witty banter. These were prime opportunities to interact closely, exchange glances, and display one's charm and groomed appearance. Hosts often arranged seating to encourage certain interactions, sometimes with romantic outcomes in mind. The combination of relaxed atmosphere, obeying, and close proximity made convivia a significant stage for Roman courtship, where all the efforts at personal grooming and perfuming were put to the ultimate test. The stakes felt higher. Without the ease of washing away yesterday's mistakes, your presentation was a more permanent statement. If you managed to smell decent and look polished, you stood out. You were literally a breath of fresh air, or at least a less stale one. You were a beacon of intentional effort in a sea of natural human aromas. And that signal that you were someone who put care and resource into your person was incredibly attractive. Historians still argue whether ancient relationships, especially those initiated through public flirting, were primarily based on genuine attraction, social and economic compatibility, or a complex blend of both, with appearance acting as a primary filter for that initial assessment. It's hard to disentangle the threads of true feeling from the practical considerations and cultural expectations that dictated so much of ancient life, including courtship and marriage. Was that admiring glance for you or for the expensive Cypriot perfume you were wearing? Probably both. A quirky tidbit, ancient Egyptians sometimes used cones of solid perfume or scented fat placed on top of their heads during feasts. As the party heated up, the cone would melt, releasing fragrance down over their hair and clothes, creating a dynamic diffusion of scent. Talk about a slow-release air freshener. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation while a glob of melting, scented fat slides down your wig. Definitely adds a unique element to flirting, trying to maintain eye contact while strategically dodging dripping perfume. So while the basic human desire to connect and find a partner is timeless, the methods and challenges were shaped by the technological limitations of the era. Flirting before soap was invented required creativity, resourcefulness, and a willingness to engage with the world using heightened sensory awareness, particularly regarding smell and appearance. It was a world where a strategically applied dollop of oil, a carefully chosen perfume, or the painful removal of body hair could be just as potent a signal as any whispered word. It was a testament to human ingenuity, adaptability, and the enduring power of trying to make the best impression you possibly can, no matter the obstacles, all in the hope of finding that special connection. And maybe, just maybe, finding someone whose natural scent, combined with their grooming efforts, you could actually tolerate. A true romantic connection in the ancient world might have been finding the person whose particular blend of sebum, sweat, and sandalwood didn't make your eyes water. Now that's love. All right, we've journeyed through the surprisingly complex world of pre-soap personal care and ancient attempts at looking and smelling presentable enough to flirt. We've scraped, we've oiled, we've endured the discomfort, and we've seen how all these efforts factored into the delicate dance of ancient courtship. Now, as the last of those images begin to fade, the communal baths, the bustling marketplace, the dimly lit rooms where scented oils shimmered and nervous glances were exchanged, let the details soften. You've absorbed quite a bit tonight about the challenges and the resilience of people long ago. There's nothing more to think about now. The history is told, the journey is complete. Your mind can drift away from the smells and textures of the ancient world, back to the quiet comfort of your own space, your own time. Just let your body sink deeper into your bed, feeling the warmth and the support beneath you. Let your breathing become slow and gentle. There's nothing else to do, nowhere else to be. Just you, here, safe and relaxed. Allow any remaining thoughts to simply float away like mist. They don't need your attention anymore. Just peace, just stillness. Drift now. You are ready to rest. Sleep deeply, sleep peacefully. Sweet dreams.